Hello everyone, welcome back to Midnight Lullaby. I know many of you are here to drift gently into sleep. Before you close your eyes, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know where in the world you're listening from. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let the story carry you into dreams. I bought the house because it was perfect for someone like me. Quiet, isolated, with enough space to spread out and work without disturbing anyone or being disturbed. After years of apartment living, of thin walls and noisy neighbors, the promise of true solitude was irresistible. The house was older, built in the 1920s, with high ceilings and hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot. It had character, the real estate agent said, and I agreed. The first few nights were everything I had hoped for. Silence. Blessed, complete silence. I could work at my computer without the sound of televisions bleeding through walls. I could read without the rhythm of footsteps from the apartment above. I could finally hear my own thoughts without competition. But on the fourth night, I heard the first marble. It was just past midnight, and I was settling into bed with a book when the sound came from directly overhead. A single, distinct impact, the unmistakable sound of a small, hard sphere hitting a wooden floor and rolling a few inches before coming to rest. I paused in my reading, listening for more, but the house returned to silence. Old houses make sounds, I reminded myself. Settling foundations, expanding wood. The occasional mouse. It was nothing to worry about. The next night, I heard 2 marbles. Same time, just past midnight. Same location directly above my bedroom. 2 distinct impacts, seconds apart. Followed by the gentle rolling sounds of spheres, finding their resting places on what sounded like bare hardwood. I got up and walked through the house, checking for possible sources. There was no one else here, of course. No upstairs neighbors. No children playing late into the night. The sound was coming from my own attic, a space I had barely glanced at when touring the house. The access was in the hallway ceiling, a simple square panel that I assumed led to nothing more interesting than insulation and cobwebs. On the third night, there were 3 marbles. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Each night at the same time, from the same location, 1 additional marble would drop and roll across what sounded like an empty wooden floor. The sounds were so clear, so precise, that I could almost see them happening. Small glass spheres, perhaps an inch in diameter, dropping from some unknown height and scattering across bare planks. I decided to investigate. The next morning, I fetched a ladder from the garage and positioned it under the attic access panel. The panel lifted easily, revealing a square of darkness that exhaled the cool, musty air of enclosed spaces. I hoisted myself up through the opening and into the attic. It was larger than I had expected, running the length of the house, with enough headroom for me to stand comfortably in the center. The floor was indeed bare wood, old planks that looked original to the house's construction. Thin streams of sunlight filtered through small vents at either end, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. And there, scattered across the floor, in no particular pattern, were dozens of marbles. They were exactly as I had imagined them. Small glass spheres in various colors, some clear, some swirled with bands of blue and green and red. They caught the light from the vents and threw tiny rainbows against the wooden walls. Beautiful, really, in the way that simple objects can be when found in unexpected places. I gathered them up, filling my pockets with their smooth weight. 47 marbles in total. Though I couldn't be sure, I had found them all in the dim light. Some had rolled into corners, others had settled between floorboards. But I collected what I could and carried them downstairs. That night, I waited and listened. Midnight came and went in perfect silence. No marbles dropped. No rolling sounds disturbed the quiet of the house. I had solved the mystery, or so I thought. Some previous owner, some child from decades past, had left a collection of marbles in the attic. Temperature changes or settling wood had finally caused them to roll and drop in a way that created the sounds I had been hearing. But the next night, I heard 4 marbles drop. 4 distinct impacts, 4 rolling sounds, all coming from the exact same location as before. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I had collected all the marbles from the attic. I had seen the empty space with my own eyes. I returned to the attic the following morning. 4 marbles lay scattered across the wooden floor, exactly as if they had fallen from a height and rolled to random resting places. These were different from the ones I had collected. Different colors, different sizes, though still unmistakably marbles. I gathered these as well, adding them to the growing collection in a jar on my kitchen counter. But I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach tighten, that there would be more marbles the next night. 5 of them, dropping at just past midnight, rolling across a floor that should have been empty. I was right. The pattern continued with mechanical precision. Each night, 1 additional marble would drop. 5, 6, 7, 8. Each morning, I would climb into the attic and collect them, adding to a jar that was becoming quite heavy with the accumulated weight of glass spheres. By the end of the first week, I had collected over 30 marbles from an attic that should have been empty. By the end of the second week, the number had grown to over 60. The jar on my kitchen counter was full, so I started a second jar. I began to research the house's history, looking for some explanation for this strange phenomenon. The previous owner had been an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who had lived here alone for nearly 20 years. Before her, the house had belonged to the Morrison family, parents and 3 children, who had lived here from the 1960s through the early 1990s. I found an old newspaper article about the Morrisons from 1987. The youngest child, a boy named Tommy, had gone missing one summer evening. He was 7 years old, last seen playing in the backyard with his collection of marbles. The search had gone on for weeks, involving police and volunteers and search dogs, but Tommy Morrison was never found. The family had moved away 2 years later, unable to continue living in the house where their son had vanished. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the now familiar sound of marbles dropping overhead, I found myself thinking about Tommy Morrison, 7 years old, playing with marbles in the backyard on a summer evening in 1987. What had happened to him? Where had he gone? And why were marbles appearing in my attic, night after night, as if someone were still playing up there in the darkness? I started counting the marbles more carefully, keeping a precise record of how many dropped each night and how many I collected each morning. The numbers always matched exactly. If 12 marbles dropped during the night, I would find exactly 12 marbles on the attic floor the next morning. But I also began to notice that the marbles themselves were changing. The early ones had been simple, the kind you might find in any toy store. But as the nights progressed, they became more elaborate. Some had intricate swirls of color, like tiny galaxies trapped in glass. Others seemed to contain actual objects, small flowers, fragments of leaves, tiny spirals of metal. A few appeared to have landscapes inside them, miniature scenes that seemed to shift and change when I looked at them from different angles. Where were they coming from? How was this possible? I set up a video camera in the attic, positioning it to record the area where the marbles seemed to fall. But each morning, when I reviewed the footage, I saw nothing. Just an empty attic floor, illuminated by infrared light, completely still and undisturbed throughout the night. Yet the marbles were always there when I climbed up to check. The camera could record the attic, but it couldn't record the marbles appearing, as if they existed in some space that technology couldn't perceive. I tried staying awake in the attic, sitting in the darkness with a flashlight, waiting to see the marbles actually drop. But nothing happened when I was present. The phenomenon only occurred when I was not directly observing it, as if my attention somehow prevented it from taking place. By the third week, I was finding 20 marbles each morning. The sound of them dropping had become a nightly ritual, as regular as clockwork. Just past midnight, I would hear them falling one by one, each impact distinct and clear, followed by the gentle rolling sounds as they scattered across the wooden floor. I began to look forward to it. There was something oddly comforting about the predictability of it, the way it marked the passage of time. Each night brought one more marble than the last, a steady accumulation of mystery that was somehow reassuring in its consistency. But on the 21st night, something changed. I was lying in bed, waiting for the familiar sounds, when I heard something else mixed in with the dropping marbles. A soft sound, almost like breathing, or perhaps like the whisper of small feet moving carefully across wooden planks. I held my breath, listening intently. There it was again. Not breathing exactly, but some kind of gentle, rhythmic sound coming from the attic. as if someone were up there, moving quietly among the falling marbles, perhaps collecting them or arranging them in some pattern I couldn't see. The next morning, when I climbed into the attic, I found something that made my hands shake as I reached for it. The 21 marbles weren't scattered randomly across the floor as they had been every other morning. They were arranged in a circle, perfectly spaced, with one marble in the center. And inside the central marble, when I held it up to the light filtering through the vents, I could see something that looked like a child's face. Not a photograph or a drawing, but an actual face suspended somehow within the glass. A boy's face, round and smiling, with dark eyes that seemed to look directly at me. The face was small but perfectly detailed, as if a living child had been somehow captured and preserved inside the marble. I nearly dropped it. But as I held it closer to the light, studying the impossible image within the glass, the face seemed to mouth a single word: play. That night, I didn't go to bed. Instead, I sat in a chair in my bedroom with a flashlight in my lap, waiting for midnight. When the time came, I heard the familiar sounds begin. But this time, I was ready. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the ceiling. "Tommy," I called softly. "Tommy Morrison. Is that you up there?" The sounds stopped immediately. Complete silence settled over the house, so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, after a long moment, came a sound I hadn't heard before. A child's laughter, soft and delighted, drifting down from the attic like a gentle echo from another time. "Will you play with me?" came a voice, faint but unmistakably that of a young boy. I found myself climbing the ladder in the darkness, flashlight in one hand, the marble with the boy's face clutched in the other. When I emerged into the attic, I saw something that took my breath away. The space was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft glow of what looked like hundreds of marbles, each one glowing with its own inner light. They covered the floor like luminous pearls, creating a galaxy of gentle illumination that made the attic seem larger, more magical than it had ever appeared in daylight. And in the center of this field of glowing spheres sat a small figure, translucent, shimmering, but unmistakably a child. Tommy Morrison, still 7 years old, still clutching a handful of marbles, looking up at me with eyes full of hope and loneliness. "I've been waiting," he said, his voice like the whisper of wind through leaves. "I've been waiting for someone to play with me." I sank down onto the wooden floor, surrounded by the glowing marbles, and looked at this ghost of a child who had been missing for over 30 years. "How long have you been here, Tommy?" "I don't know," he said, his form flickering slightly like a candle flame in a breeze. "I was playing in the backyard, and then I was here. But it's lonely playing by yourself. The marbles help. Each one holds a memory, a moment of happiness. But it's not the same as having a friend." He held out his hand, and I could see that his palm was full of marbles that seemed to contain tiny moving scenes. Children playing in sunny yards, birthday parties, summer afternoons filled with laughter. "Will you help me collect happy memories?" he asked. "The marbles find them, but I need someone to help me gather them up." And suddenly I understood. The marbles weren't random objects falling from nowhere. They were Tommy's attempts to collect moments of joy, fragments of the life he had lost. Each night, one more memory would crystallize into glass. One more moment of happiness would be preserved in the only way he knew how. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. "I'll help you collect them." From that night forward, my routine changed. Each evening around midnight, I would climb into the attic and help Tommy gather the marbles that appeared there. Some contained memories that seemed to be his own, glimpses of a childhood cut short, moments of play and discovery preserved in glass. Others seemed to be memories from other children, other lives, as if happiness itself could transcend individual experience and become something universal. We would arrange them in patterns, sort them by color and content, create elaborate displays that filled the attic with soft, pearl-like light. Tommy would tell me about each one, describing the scenes trapped within their curved surfaces, sharing the emotions they contained. "This one has a snow day," he would say, holding up a white marble that seemed to contain swirling flakes. "And this one has the feeling of a mother's hug." The blue marble in his other hand pulsed gently with warmth. I stopped trying to solve the mystery of Tommy, Morrison's disappearance. It didn't matter where he had gone or how he had ended up in my attic. What mattered was that he was there, and he was lonely, and I could help him collect the fragments of joy that fell like gifts from some benevolent universe. The house no longer felt empty. Each night brought new marbles, new memories to catalogue and preserve. My collection grew to hundreds, then thousands, filling jars and boxes throughout the house. Each one was a small universe of happiness, a crystallized moment of pure joy. And Tommy was no longer alone. Sometimes, late at night, I can hear him moving around up there, even when I'm not with him, arranging his marbles, organizing his collection of captured happiness. The sounds no longer seem mysterious or frightening. They sound like what they are, a child at play, finally having found someone willing to share in his endless game of gathering light. The marbles still drop every night, one more than the night before, and I still climb up to help collect them. But now I understand what they really are, proof that joy exists in every moment, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be preserved, waiting to be shared with anyone patient enough to listen for the sound of happiness falling gently through the darkness. Story 2. My shift at the security company ends at 11:30, which means I walk past Meridian Boutique every night at exactly 11:47. I know this because I've timed it. The way you time things when your life becomes a series of small, predictable rituals that keep the larger uncertainties at bay. The boutique sits on the corner of 5th and Elm, its large windows casting rectangles of warm light across the empty sidewalk. During the day, those windows showcase the latest fashion trends on pristine white mannequins, their plastic faces serene and eternally poised. At night, when the street belongs to shift workers like me and the occasional taxi, the mannequins stand guard over their silent kingdom of silk and cashmere. I first noticed something odd 3 weeks ago, though I didn't think much of it at the time. The central mannequin, a tall, elegant figure in a burgundy evening dress, had been positioned with her left arm extended, palm up, as if offering something to passers-by. When I walked by that Tuesday night, her arm was lowered, resting naturally at her side. Store employees must have adjusted the display, I thought. Nothing unusual about that. But the next night, she was different again. Her head, which had been turned toward the street, now faced the back of the store. The gesture seemed almost shy, withdrawn. I stopped walking and stared through the glass. The mannequin's plastic features held no expression, they never did. Yet something in her posture suggested a kind of melancholy that made my chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. The streetlight above me flickered, casting shifting shadows across the window display. And for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw her chest rise and fall with a single, quiet breath. But mannequins don't breathe, and store employees make display adjustments. These were facts, solid and rational, anchor points in a world that sometimes felt too fluid, too open to interpretation. I continued home to my studio apartment, where I heated a frozen dinner and fell asleep to the glow of late night television. The pattern established itself gradually, the way patterns do when you're not quite ready to acknowledge them. Each night, at exactly 11:47, I would pass the boutique and catalog the changes. The burgundy, dressed mannequin, I had begun thinking of her as burgundy, was never in quite the same position as the night before. Sometimes the changes were subtle, a slight tilt of the head, a shift in the angle of her shoulders. Other times, they were more dramatic. One night, she faced the window directly, both palms pressed against the glass as if she were trying to push through it. Another night, she stood with her back to the street, arms wrapped around herself in what looked disturbingly like grief. I started taking photos with my phone, telling myself I was documenting evidence of unusually frequent display changes. The boutique staff must be remarkably dedicated to their visual merchandising, I reasoned. Perhaps they were testing different arrangements to see which drew the most attention. But the photos revealed something that my nightly observations had somehow missed. The other mannequins were changing too. In Tuesday's photo, 3 figures stood in a loose triangle facing different directions. By Thursday, they had moved closer together, their poses more intimate, conspiratorial. By the following Tuesday, they seemed to be having a conversation, their plastic heads inclined toward one another in postures of deep attention. And Burgundy stood apart from them, always apart, her pose growing more isolated, more desperate with each passing night. I began altering my route home to pass the boutique multiple times, circling the block at different hours to see if I could catch them in the act of what? Moving, changing. The very thought made me feel unmoored from reality, yet I couldn't stop myself from checking. At 9 p.m., they were always motionless, perfectly arranged in whatever configuration they'd held during business hours. At midnight, they had already shifted into their new positions for the next day. The transformation happened sometime between those hours, in the dead space when the city dozed, and only the mannequins were awake to witness their own metamorphosis. I started staying later at work, manufacturing excuses to linger until past midnight, then racing to the boutique. But I was always too late. Whatever happened in that window occurred in the moments I couldn't observe, as if my presence itself prevented the phenomenon. The photos on my phone multiplied. Burgundy reaching toward the other mannequins. Burgundy turned away from them. Burgundy crouched in the corner of the display, her arms wrapped around her knees, in a posture of such profound loneliness that looking at the image made my throat constrict. I began to dream about her. In the dreams, she could speak, her voice high and crystalline, like wind chimes. She told me about the weight of being watched, about the ache of standing still, when everything inside you wants to move. She told me about the others, how they whispered plans and secrets in the dark hours, how they belonged to something she could never be part of. They remember being human, she said in one dream, her plastic lips moving with impossible grace. But I was born here, in this window, under these lights. I have no memories of breath or heartbeat, or the feeling of fabric against skin. I have only stillness, and the longing for what I've never known. I woke from these dreams with tears on my cheeks and a yearning I couldn't name. My friends, the few I still maintained contact with, began to notice changes in me. I was distracted, absent in conversations, perpetually checking my watch as 11:30 approached. I canceled plans, avoided social gatherings, structured my entire existence around that nightly walk past the boutique. You seem obsessed with work, my friend Marcus said over coffee one Saturday afternoon. When's the last time you took a vacation? Did something that wasn't part of your routine? I wanted to tell him about Burgundy, about the photographs, about the dreams. But how do you explain that you've fallen in love with a mannequin's loneliness? How do you describe the way your heart races when you see she's moved closer to the window, as if reaching for you specifically? Instead, I mumbled something about being fine and cut the coffee short. That night, I arrived at the boutique to find the window empty. Completely, utterly empty. The other mannequins were gone. The display platforms stood bare under the warm lights. Even the clothing had been removed, leaving only naked chrome stands and empty space. Burgundy was nowhere to be seen. Panic flooded my system like ice water. I pressed my face against the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes, to peer into the darkened interior of the store. Maybe they were doing renovations. Maybe the display was being updated. Maybe. A soft tap against the glass made me stumble backward. There, on the other side of the window, stood Burgundy. Not in the display area, but in the main section of the store, between the racks of clothes. She was still wearing the burgundy dress, but something about her seemed different, more solid, more present. She raised one hand and placed it against the glass, directly opposite where mine had been moments before. I lifted my trembling hand and matched her gesture. The glass between us felt warm, almost alive, humming with a frequency I could feel in my bones. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. But I could read her lips, clear as daylight. Help me. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, then hung up before it connected. What would I tell them? That a mannequin was trapped inside a clothing store. That she needed help. They would think I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was having a breakdown. I spent the rest of the night walking circles around the block, returning to the window every few minutes to find her still there, still waiting, her hand pressed against the glass like a prayer. When morning came and the store opened, she was gone. The window was restored to its daytime configuration, new mannequins in new poses, displaying the latest arrivals. The burgundy dress hung on a rack inside, empty and still. I never saw her again, but sometimes, when I walk past other stores at night, I catch glimpses in my peripheral vision. A figure in a window, standing just a little too naturally. A mannequin whose pose seems too lifelike, too intentional. And I wonder if I'm seeing others like her, the ones who developed consciousness in the spaces between observation, who learned to want and need and hope in the quiet hours when no one was watching. I wonder if they're all trapped, all waiting for someone to notice their subtle movements, their desperate attempts at communication. I wonder if loneliness, when concentrated enough, can breathe life into anything, even plastic and chrome, and the dreams of connection. And I wonder, as I hurry past windows that seem too alive, if I was the only one who ever truly saw her move, or if she was the only one who ever truly saw me. The city sleeps, but the windows stay awake, and somewhere behind glass and light, they're still dancing their silent ballet of hope and isolation, still reaching for something they'll never quite touch, still waiting for someone to set them free. Story 3. I inherited the clock from my grandmother's estate. It sat among her things like a patient spider. All brass and wood and complicated mechanics that belonged to an era when time was measured in heartbeats rather than microseconds. The executor said it hadn't worked in years. But when I brought it home and hung it on my living room wall, it started ticking immediately. Tick, tock, tock. The sound was comforting at first, a heartbeat for my empty apartment, a rhythm that made the silence less oppressive. I would fall asleep on the couch listening to it. The steady percussion better than any white noise machine. The second hand swept around the face in perfect circles. marking moments that felt meaningful simply for being marked. It was Thursday when I first noticed. I was working from home. Laptop open on the coffee table, spreadsheets blurring together into a maze of numbers that had stopped making sense hours ago. I glanced at the clock. 3:47 p.m. I went back to work, made some tea, answered emails, stretched my aching neck. Looked again. 3:47 p.m. The second hand was moving. I could see it sweeping around, steady and sure. But when it completed its circuit and reached the 12 again, the minute hand hadn't advanced. The second hand had made a full revolution and ended up exactly where it started, as if that minute was a closed loop, a serpent swallowing its tail. I watched it complete another circuit, and another. The tick-tock continued, relentless and perfect, but time itself had become stuck, like a record skipping on the same groove. My laptop clock read 3:52 p.m. My phone agreed, but the antique clock on my wall insisted it was still 347, and had been for... How long now? I stood up, walked to the clock, studied its face. The brass was tarnished in places, creating patterns that looked like continents on an ancient map. The numbers were Roman numerals, painted in a shade of black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The second hand was thin as a needle, sharp-looking, cutting through the air with each tick. Tick, tock, tick, tock. I reached up and touched the glass face. It was cold, much colder than the room, and my fingertip left a brief fog of condensation that faded almost instantly. The second hand passed under my finger, and I felt something, a vibration, a pulse, a sensation like touching a living thing's pulse point. The hand completed its revolution, still 3:47. I went back to work, but concentration was impossible. The ticking seemed louder now. Or maybe I was just more aware of it. Each tick felt like it was happening inside my skull. A metronome for thoughts that wouldn't quite form. I found myself breathing in time with it, heartbeat trying to synchronize, body attempting to match the rhythm of a minute that wouldn't end. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the clock through the wall. The ticking carried through the apartment's bones, conducted by wood and plaster, and the very air itself. In the darkness, I could almost see the second hand moving, describing its endless circle, going nowhere with perfect precision. Tick, tick, tock. I must have slept, because I dreamed. I dreamed I was inside the clock, standing on the face like it was a floor, watching the second hand sweep toward me like a scythe. It passed through me without sensation, but each time it did, I felt younger, then older, then younger again, aging and reversing in a cycle that made my teeth ache and my bones sing. The minute hand loomed above like a monolith, frozen at 47, while I ran in circles, chasing or fleeing the second hand. I couldn't tell which. I woke at 3:47 a.m. The clock in the living room was loud in the pre-dawn silence. I padded out in bare feet. The hardwood floor cold enough to make me gasp. The clock hung exactly where I'd left it, but something was different. The second hand was moving counterclockwise. No, that wasn't right. I rubbed my eyes, looked again. clockwise as it should be. But I could have sworn. There. It stuttered, moved backward for just a fraction of a second before resuming its forward motion, like it was testing boundaries, seeing what it could get away with while I watched. I made coffee and sat on the couch, observing. The tick-tock continued, but now I noticed variations in the rhythm. Sometimes the tick was slightly longer than the tock. Sometimes 2 ticks would come in rapid succession, like a hiccup in time. The second hand would occasionally slow, as it climbed from 6 to 12, then race down the other side, as if making up for lost time. My phone rang at 7 a.m., my mother calling to check in. I told her about the clock, about how it had been grandmother's. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, she always claimed it showed true time, not clock time. I never knew what she meant. A true time. What was true about a minute that never ended? I worked from home again, but kept getting pulled back to the clock. I started timing it with my phone's stopwatch. 60 seconds on my phone, but the clock's second hand would complete sometimes 50, 8 seconds, sometimes 63. Never exactly 60. As if it was measuring something else entirely, something that looked like time, but wasn't quite. By evening, I'd filled a notebook with observations. The second hand slowed during phone calls. It sped up when I was reading. It moved normally when I wasn't watching, but the moment my attention focused on it, the rhythm would shift, like a heartbeat becoming conscious of itself. The minute hand still hadn't moved from 40. 7. The hour hand remained frozen at 3. 347, eternal and insistent. That night. I moved my laptop to the living room and worked facing the clock. The ticking became my soundtrack, and gradually, I stopped hearing it as sound and started feeling it as texture. Rough ticks, smooth talks, sharp ticks that made my molars ache. Soft talks that felt like velvet against my eardrums. Around midnight, according to every clock, except the one on my wall, I noticed the shadows. The clock was casting multiple shadows, as if lit by different light sources that didn't exist in my apartment. One shadow showed the hands at 3:47, another showed them at 6:15. A third showed an arrangement that wasn't possible on a standard clock face. Hands bent at angles that shouldn't exist. I turned off all the lights except one lamp. The multiple shadows remained. Tick, tock, tock. I approached the clock, watched the shadows dance on the wall behind it. They moved independently of the actual hands, showing times that had been or would be or never were. I reached out to touch one of the shadows, and my finger went cold, then numb, as if I'd touched something so far below, freezing it burned. When I pulled my hand back, my fingernail had grown. Just that one nail, now extending a quarter inch beyond where it had been moments before, as if time had passed for that finger alone. Weeks of growth in an instant. I stumbled backward, fell onto the couch, held my hand up to the lamplight. The nail was real, solid, needing to be cut. But the rest of me remained unchanged, untouched by whatever temporal slipstream I'd contacted. The clock ticked louder, Or maybe that was my pulse. Hard to tell anymore. Saturday, or what my phone claimed was Saturday. I invited my friend Marcus over. I needed someone else to see this, to confirm I wasn't losing my mind to the rhythm of an antique timepiece. "It's beautiful," he said, admiring the clock. "Very steampunk. Does it work? Look at it," I said. "What time does it say?" 3:47, he answered immediately, then frowned. "That can't be right. It's past 5. We watched together." I pointed out the second hand, completing its circuit over and over without the minute hand advancing. Marcus checked his phone, checked the clock, checked his phone again. His breathing had started to match the tick-tock rhythm. Everyone's did, eventually. "Maybe it's broken," he suggested, but his voice was uncertain. We both knew broken clocks didn't tick with such perfect precision. He stayed for dinner. We ate while the clock marked on, time in the background. Marcus kept glancing at it, then at his watch, as if trying to reconcile two different versions of reality. When he left, he said, "You should get it fixed." But we both knew I couldn't. The clock wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended. That night, I measured the intervals between ticks with increasing precision. Sometimes 0.9 seconds, sometimes 1.2. But when I averaged them over an hour, they came out to exactly 1 second per tick. The variations canceled each other out, creating perfect timekeeping from imperfect moments. I fell asleep on the couch and dreamed I was the second hand, sweeping around the face, trying to push the minute hand forward, but always sliding beneath it, unable to make contact. The minute hand was impossibly heavy, made of condensed time, all the 3D47s that had ever existed compressed into a single immovable moment. Sunday was when I heard the voices. Not voices. Exactly. More like whispers hidden in the mechanism, sounds that emerged between the tick and the talk. If I listened carefully, if I held my breath and let my heart beat slow to match the clock's rhythm, I could almost make out words. Round and round and round. 47 minutes of forever. Time is a circle with no circumference. Who fragments that might have been my imagination? Except that when I recorded the clock on my phone and played it back slowed down, the voices became clearer. They were speaking in reverse, or sideways to normal time. Messages from moments that hadn't happened yet, or had already unhappened. I researched the clock online, finding nothing about the maker, the model, the year. It existed without history, or perhaps outside of history. My grandmother had never mentioned it in life, and no one else in the family remembered seeing it before. It had appeared in her possessions. It had always been there, waiting. Monday came with a decision. I would go to work in the office, escape the clock's presence for 8 hours. But as I sat at my desk, I could still hear it. Impossible, given the distance, but the tick-tock rhythm continued in my head, in my chest, in the very pulse of my blood. My coworkers spoke, but their words seemed mistimed, arriving a fraction of a second before, or after their lips moved. "You look tired," Janet said. but I heard it as, "Tired look you." The office clocks all read different times. Not dramatically different, just minutes apart, as if they couldn't agree on exactly when now was. I found myself checking them obsessively, trying to find one that showed 3:47, but they all carefully avoided that particular minute. I left early, drawn home by a gravitational pull I couldn't resist. The clock was waiting. The second hand still swept its endless circle. The minute hand still pointed at 47. But now I noticed something new. The hour hand had moved. Just slightly, a hair's width. But it was no longer pointing exactly at 3. It was moving toward 4. So slowly that watching it was like watching continental drift. I did the math. If the second hand made 60 revolutions to move the minute hand 1 minute, and the minute hand needed to make. But no, that wasn't how it was working. The hour hand was moving independently, following its own logic, its own relationship with time. I sat and watched and listened. The ticking had developed harmonics now, subtones that created a chord with each beat. The chord changed gradually, imperceptibly. But after an hour, I realized I was hearing a melody played so slowly that each note lasted minutes. It was beautiful and terrible. A song that would take years to complete. Tuesday night, a week since I'd noticed the stopped minute, I discovered I could see the clock with my eyes closed. It appeared on the inside of my eyelids, perfect in every detail. The second hand still moving, still circling, still going nowhere. Even in absolute darkness, even with my hands pressed over my eyes, the clock remained visible, as if it had been burned into my retina or deeper, into the visual cortex itself. I tried to leave the apartment, go for a walk, get away from the sound. But 3 blocks away, I heard it again. Tick-tock, tick-tock, coming from a stranger's wristwatch. 5 blocks away, it emanated from a bank's digital display, the numbers pulsing in rhythm. 7 blocks away, I heard it in the walk signals at crosswalks, in car engines, in the footsteps of other pedestrians. The whole city was ticking in time with my grandmother's clock. Or maybe I was just hearing it everywhere, the way you see faces in clouds once you start looking for them. But when I checked my phone, it read 3:47. I waited, watched the seconds count up, 48, 49, 50, then blinked, and it was 3:47 again. Either the clock was wrong, or everything else was. I ran home, burst through the door, stared at the clock. It hadn't changed. Of course it hadn't changed. Change required time to pass, and time wasn't passing here, just circling, like water around a drain that never quite empties. I grabbed the clock, tried to pull it from the wall. It didn't budge. Not stuck. Not mounted firmly, but literally immovable, as if it had infinite mass. I pulled until my muscles screamed, until my hands went numb from gripping the wooden frame. The clock remained perfectly still, tick-tocking its non-time, undisturbed by my efforts. That night, I called my mother again. "The clock," I said. "Grandmother's clock. Tell me about it." She was quiet for so long I thought the connection had dropped. Then, she bought it from an estate sale, when she was young. Said it was already broken when she got it, but she liked the sound it made. She claimed it helped her sleep. Did she ever say anything else? Anything strange, she said. My mother paused, choosing her words carefully. She said, it showed the moment when everything changed, or when nothing changed. I never understood what she meant. 3:47, the moment when everything changed, or nothing. I sat in front of the clock as midnight approached. According to other clocks, less reliable clocks, clocks that didn't understand true time. The second hand swept around and around, a lighthouse beam circling in temporal fog. The ticking had become so integral to my environment that silence would have been louder. As my phone switched from 11:59 to 12:500, the clock's hour hand finally completed its journey to 4:47. The minute hand hadn't moved. Still 47. Always 47. But now it was a different hour's 47, and somehow that made all the difference. The ticking changed pitch, just slightly, like a key change in music that shifts the entire emotional color of a song. The shadows cast by the clock rearranged themselves into new, impossible configurations. And I understood, finally, what my grandmother had known. The clock wasn't broken. It was perfect. It showed the only moment that mattered, the eternal now, the forever present, the minute that contains all minutes. Every 3:47 that had ever existed or would exist was compressed into this single point, this endless loop, this perfect prison of time. I've been watching it for days now, or years, or minutes. Hard to say when every duration feels the same. When the second hand sweeps away any accumulation of moments. My phone says it's Thursday, but it said that yesterday, and it will say it tomorrow. The calendar on my laptop shows dates that don't make sense in sequence. March 15th, followed by January 9th, followed by September 32nd, a date that shouldn't exist but does, here in the clock's influence. My hair is longer or shorter, both neither. I've aged and grown younger simultaneously, existing in all states at once. That the food in my refrigerator neither spoils nor stays fresh, but exists in a superposition of edibility. I eat when the second hand points to 12, sleep when it points to 6, wake when it points to 9. But these could be different revolutions or the same one, repeated endlessly. Visitors come, I think. Marcus, maybe, or my mother, or strangers, or no one. They speak to me in words that arrive in the wrong order, or the right order from their perspective. They look at the clock and see different times. 3:47, 4:47, 11:47, but always 47 minutes. Always that specific minute that contains all minutes. The mail arrives daily, or never, or all at once. Letters from the past, bills from the future, packages I haven't ordered yet, but will, or did, or am ordering right now in a timeline adjacent to this one. The mailman's shadow falls differently each time, as if the sun can't decide where it should be in relation to a house that exists outside of normal time. I've started writing on the walls. Not words, but tick marks, trying to count the revolutions of the second hand. But the marks fade and reappear, arrange and rearrange themselves. Sometimes they spell words etarnint-y, circle, freedom. Sometimes they form pictures, clock faces, spirals, my grandmother's face, young and old simultaneously. The ticking has become my heartbeat, or my heartbeat has become the ticking. When I press my fingers to my wrist, I feel the rhythm. Tick-tock, tick-tock, but no pulse beneath it. Just the mechanical marking of non-time. The endless sweep of the second hand through my veins. I wonder if this is what my grandmother felt. If she sat here, in this same spot, watching the same minute repeat, feeling time pool around her, like water that can't drain. Did she find peace in it? Horror? Both? Neither. The clock ticks on. The second hand circles. The minute hand points to 47. The hour hand creeps toward 5, or back toward 3, or both directions at once. Time passes without passing, accumulates without accumulating, means everything and nothing. I could leave. I know that. I could walk out the door. Never come back. Let someone else inherit the clock and its perfect, broken time. But I also know I won't. Can't. The clock needs a witness, someone to observe its endless moment, to confirm that time is happening even when it isn't. So I sit. I watch. I listen. Tick, tick, tock. The second hand completes another revolution. Still 40-47. Always 40-47. Forever 40-47. And in that eternal minute, in that perfect loop, in that prison that might be freedom, I finally understand what my grandmother knew, what the clock has always been trying to tell me. Time isn't a river. It's a wheel. And we're all just going round and round and round and round and... Story 4. I first noticed it on a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was at that perfect angle where shadows stretch long and thin across the pavement, turning every pedestrian into a giant. I was walking home from the grocery store, plastic bags cutting grooves into my palms. When I stopped to adjust my grip, that's when I saw it. My shadow kept walking. Just for a moment. Maybe 2 steps, 3 at most, before it snapped back to my feet like a rubber band pulled too far. I stood there on the sidewalk, bags hanging heavy, watching my shadow behave exactly as it should. Perfectly normal. Perfectly attached. Perfectly mine. But I knew what I had seen. The next time was at the office. Fluorescent lights don't usually cast strong shadows. But there's this one spot by the water cooler where the overhead fixture is burnt out. And the light from the hallway creates a perfect conditions for shadow play. I was filling my cup, listening to the glug, glug, glug of the water, when I felt it more than saw it. A sense of movement that didn't belong to me. My shadow was leaning against the wall while I stood straight. Its posture was casual, relaxed, like someone waiting for a friend who's running late. I jerked upright, spilling water across my shirt, and the shadow snapped back into place. But for just a second, I could have sworn it shrugged at me. The wet spot on my shirt felt colder than it should have, spreading across my chest like fingers of ice. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, a rhythm that seemed just slightly off from the fluorescent hum above. My coworker Janet walked by. her heels clicking on the linoleum. Click, 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 and her shadow followed obediently behind her. I watched it with envy. That night, I tested it. I stood in my bedroom with a single lamp positioned behind me, creating a sharp silhouette on the white wall. I raised my arm. My shadow raised its arm.
I jumped.
My shadow jumped. I spun in a circle, and my shadow spun too, perfectly synchronized. Everything normal. Then I stopped abruptly mid-spin. The shadow completed the rotation. It stood facing me for a moment. Can a shadow face anything? Before slowly, deliberately, matching my frozen posture. I could hear my breathing, ragged and too loud in the quiet room. The lamp buzzed softly, a mosquito drone that made my teeth ache. The shadow waited, patient as death, for my next move. I didn't sleep that night. I kept all the lights on, eliminating shadows wherever possible. But you can never eliminate them all. They pool in corners, lurk under furniture, gather in the folds of curtains, and I could feel mine somewhere in those dark spaces, moving without me. The next day, walking to work, I watched our paired movements in shop windows. My shadow and I, moving in what should have been perfect harmony. But there was a delay now, barely perceptible, like watching a dubbed movie where the lips don't quite match the words. A fraction of a second between my step and its step, between my gesture and its echo. People passed me on the street, and I wondered if they could see it too. Could they tell that my shadow was becoming something other? Or was this madness so perfectly personal that only I could perceive it? Their shadows behaved normally, attached and obedient, dark puppets on invisible strings. Mine walked beside me like a companion who was growing tired of my company. At crosswalks, I noticed it would start moving before the light changed, pulling forward while I waited for the signal. Just a lean at first, then actual steps into the street, while I stood frozen on the curb, terrified that cars would somehow hit it, and, by extension, me. But vehicles passed through it without consequence, and each time it would slouch back to my feet with what felt like disappointment. The sound of traffic became oppressive. Engines growling, brakes squealing, horns honking in angry conversation. But underneath it all, I could hear something else, footsteps that weren't quite synchronized with mine. An echo that came too early, not too late. The sound of something walking just ahead of me, always just ahead, wearing my shape but not my substance. By Thursday, the gap had widened. I would stop at my desk, but my shadow would keep walking to the break room. I'd sit in meetings, watching my shadow pace along the conference room wall while everyone else's remained seated. My boss asked if I was feeling all right. I told him I was fine, just tired, while my shadow made obscene gestures behind his head. The bathroom mirrors became interrogation chambers. I'd stand before them, studying the interplay of light and form, trying to understand what was happening. In reflections, shadows should appear reversed, but mine had started appearing as it pleased. Sometimes reversed, sometimes not. Sometimes absent altogether, even though the lighting demanded its presence. The paper towel dispenser in the men's room made a specific sound. A mechanical chunk, whir, that began to sound like laughter. My shadow would lean against the sink while I washed my hands, and I could swear I felt its weight, a presence that had mass without matter. The water would run cold, then hot, then cold again, as if something was playing with the pipes. Friday afternoon, I called in sick for the rest of the day. Not sick, exactly, but certainly not well. I walked home through the park, taking the long way, trying to tire it out. Can you exhaust a shadow? Can you outlast something that exists only as an absence of light? The trees created a lattice of shadows on the path, and mine wove between them like it was dancing with friends I couldn't see. Children played on the swings, their shadows swinging in perfect time. A dog chased a frisbee, its shadow an eager partner in the game. And mine walked ahead, behind, beside, everywhere but where it should be. I stopped at a bench and sat down. My shadow remained standing. "What do you want?" I asked it, feeling foolish but desperate. It, of course, didn't answer, but it did something worse. It sat down on the bench beside me. Not beneath me where it belonged, but beside me, like we were two old friends enjoying the afternoon sun. I could feel the bench shift slightly, as if actual weight had settled onto it. The wood creaked in protest or welcome. An elderly woman walked by with her terrier. The dog stopped, hackles raised, growling at the empty space beside me, where my shadow sat. The woman tugged its leash, apologizing, but I saw her eyes. The way they tracked to my side, saw something, then quickly looked away. She walked faster after that. Her shadow and her dog's shadow properly behaved, properly attached, properly real. The sun was setting, and shadows were growing longer. Everyone's shadows were stretching, distorting, becoming evening giants. Mine had started walking circles around me, like a shark circling prey, or a partner in some ancient dance I didn't know the steps to. I could hear its footsteps now. Not on the pavement, but somewhere else. Somewhere just outside of normal hearing. A rhythm that made my bones ache. I ran. I ran home through streets that were losing their light, watching my shadow sprint ahead. Beside, behind, a dark companion that moved with purpose I couldn't understand. My breath came in gasps that echoed wrong, as if I was breathing in a room much larger than the open air. My feet slapped against concrete, but the sound came back multiplied, like a crowd running where only I existed. At home, I turned on every light, every lamp, every overhead, even the LED strips I'd installed under the kitchen cabinets. The apartment blazed with brightness, and still there were shadows. Smaller, weaker, but there. And mine moved among them like it owned the place. I watched it slide along the walls, independent now of any movement I made. It would pause at picture frames, examining photos of people I knew. It traced the spines of books on my shelf, lingering on titles I'd never opened. It stood at windows, looking out at views I couldn't see from its angle. The refrigerator hummed its mechanical hymn. punctuated by the tick of the clock on the wall. Tick, 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 but sometimes tick-tick, as if time itself was stuttering. I could hear my neighbor's television through the thin walls, canned laughter that seemed directed at my situation. Everything had a sound now, a voice in the symphony of an apartment that felt less and less like mine. Saturday, I didn't leave bed until noon. Not because I was sleeping, sleep was impossible, but because my shadow had spent the night wandering, and I was afraid of what would happen if I joined it. I could hear it moving through the apartment, the whisper of its passage, the subtle shift of air it displaced. How does something without substance displace air? How does absence create presence? When I finally emerged, I found things moved. Nothing dramatic. A book shifted on the coffee table, a chair angled differently, the remote control on the wrong side of the couch. My shadow stood in the kitchen, perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for me. The morning light through the window should have cast it toward the refrigerator, but it stood facing the window instead, looking out at something I couldn't see. "Are you me?" I asked it. "Were you always me?" It didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the question, but I noticed something that made my skin crawl. It had started to have definition. Shadows are supposed to be flat, two-dimensional representations, but mine had begun to show depth. I could make out the suggestion of features in its head, shape, the hint of fingers in its hand, shapes. It was becoming more, while I felt like I was becoming less. The weekend passed in a blur of observation and avoidance. I watched my shadow live a parallel life in my apartment. It would sit at my desk, typing on an invisible keyboard. It would stand at the stove, cooking meals I couldn't smell. It would lie on the couch, reading books that didn't exist. And all the while, I felt myself growing thinner, less substantial, as if it was pulling reality from me one moment at a time. Sunday night, I couldn't find my reflection in the bathroom mirror, only my shadow, standing where my reflection should be. Monday came with a decision. I had to go to work, had to maintain normalcy, had to pretend that my shadow wasn't living its own life parallel to mine. I dressed carefully, watching it dress too in its shadow clothes. We left the apartment together, but separate, walking to work like strangers who happened to be going the same way. At the office, no one seemed to notice that my shadow would leave meetings early, or that it would be at my desk while I was in the break room. Or maybe they did notice and chose not to see, the way people choose not to see many uncomfortable truths. Janet asked if I'd lost weight. Tom mentioned I looked tired. My boss suggested I take some vacation time. But how do you vacation from your own shadow? Tuesday, a week since I first noticed. Everything changed. I was walking home. The same road, the same time, the same angle of sun. I stopped at the exact spot where I'd first seen my shadow walk without me. And this time, when I stopped, it didn't snap back. It just kept walking. I watched it move down the sidewalk, growing smaller with distance, but somehow more real. People walked through it without notice, but I saw dogs shy away, saw birds adjust their flight paths, saw the way other shadows seemed to part for it. I tried to follow, but my feet felt rooted. Not frozen, not paralyzed, but suddenly uncertain of their purpose. Was I supposed to walk? How did walking work? The simple act of putting one foot in front of the other seemed impossibly complex, without my shadow to show me. How? A child walked by, holding her mother's hand. She looked at me, then at my shadow disappearing down the street, then back at me. "Mister," she said, "you dropped something." Her mother pulled her along, apologizing, but the child kept looking back. She could see it. She could see the absence where my shadow should be. The wrongness of a person standing in sunlight without casting darkness. I stood there until the sun set, until shadows became meaningless in the dark. Then I walked home, shadowless, feeling both lighter and heavier than I'd ever felt. The streetlights created pools of yellow illumination, and in each one, I saw other people's shadows behaving normally. But for me, nothing, no shadow, no dark companion, no evidence that I blocked light. At home, my shadow was already there. It stood in the living room, three-dimensional now, fully formed. Not dark anymore, but not light either. Something in between. Something that existed in the space between states. It looked like me, but not like me. More like the idea of me, the concept of me, the part of me that had always walked alongside, but never been acknowledged. "Welcome home," I said to it, or it said to me. I'm not sure anymore which of us spoke. We sat on opposite sides of the room, studying each other. It moved when I moved, but by choice now, not compulsion. A mirror that could choose not to reflect. A shadow that could choose not to follow. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. The neighbor's television provided its laugh track. And we sat, the shadow and I. Or me and my shadow. Or two things that had once been one thing, trying to remember which of us was supposed to be real. Days have passed, or maybe weeks. Time moves strangely when you're not sure if you're the person or the shadow. We take turns now. Going to work, shopping for groceries, living the life we used to share. People don't seem to notice the difference, or maybe they do and choose not to say anything. It's surprising how much strangers will ignore to avoid an awkward conversation. Sometimes I cast a shadow. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I see my reflection. Sometimes I see its. The boundaries have blurred beyond recognition, and I've stopped trying to keep track of which one of us started as real. Does it matter? We both exist now. Parallel lives in the same space, dark and light interchanging roles. Late at night, when shadows should be sleeping, I hear it moving through the apartment. Or maybe it hears me. We pass each other in the hallway, nodding politely. Two strangers who share a history neither fully remembers. The footsteps echo, mine it's ours, creating rhythms that almost make sense if you don't listen too closely. I've started watching other people's shadows, looking for signs of independence. Sometimes I think I see it. A shadow that leans when its person stands straight. A shadow that gestures when its person is still. But maybe I'm just seeing what I want to see, finding company in a loneliness that's doubled by being shared. The child from the street was right. I did drop something, or maybe something dropped me. Either way, we're both here now, the shadow and I, learning to coexist in a world that only has room for one of us. Tomorrow, one of us will go to work. One of us will cast a shadow. One of us will be real. Tonight, neither of us is sure which. Story 5. I've been brushing my teeth for exactly 3 minutes every night since I was 7 years old. Mother taught me to count. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, all the way to 180. Tonight, I stand before the bathroom mirror, foam gathering at the corners of my mouth, counting as I always do. 73 Mississippi, 74 Mississippi. The bathroom feels colder than usual. The tiles beneath my bare feet send shivers up my spine, each one a tiny electric current that makes my skin prickle. I can hear the old pipes groaning behind the walls, a deep, guttural sound like something breathing through water. The fluorescent light above flickers, once, twice, then steadies itself with a faint buzzing that settles into the base of my skull. 100 Mississippi. 101 Mississippi. I lean forward to spit, and that's when I see it. Or rather, when I don't see it. My reflection doesn't lean with me. It stands perfectly still, toothbrush suspended mid-air, foam dripping slowly from its chin. I freeze, heart suddenly hammering against my ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. The reflection blinks. I haven't blinked. I straighten up slowly, watching as my reflection. No, not mine anymore, something else wearing my face. Tilts its head to the side. The movement is fluid, almost curious, like a predator studying prey it doesn't quite recognize. The toothbrush in its hand drops into the sink with a plastic clatter that echoes too loudly in the small space. My own toothbrush feels suddenly heavy, the weight of it pulling my arm down. I can taste copper mixing with the mint of the toothpaste. Have I been brushing too hard? The bristles feel sharper now, like tiny needles scraping against my gums. The thing in the mirror smiles. It's my mouth, my teeth, my lips. But the expression is wrong. It's too wide, stretching further than facial muscles should allow. The corners curl up in a way that makes my stomach turn, revealing teeth that seem to multiply the longer I stare. Are there more teeth than before? I try to count them, but they shift and blur, refusing to stay still long enough for inventory. 150 Mississippi. When did I start counting again? The smile grows wider. I can hear it. Actually hear it. The skin stretching like old leather being pulled taut. There's a wet sound, like lips peeling apart after being pressed together too long. My own mouth remains closed. Jaw clenched so tight I can feel my molars grinding against each other, sending vibrations through my skull. I want to look away, but my eyes won't move. They're locked onto those eyes in the mirror. My eyes, but not my eyes. They're the right color. the right shape, but there's something behind them, something vast and empty and hungry. The pupils dilate and contract in a rhythm that doesn't match the bathroom light, pulsing like a heartbeat that isn't synchronized with mine. The pipes grown louder now, a symphony of metal stress and water pressure that sounds almost like voices. Whispers, maybe, or laughter. The sound wraps around me, seeping through my skin until I can feel it in my bones. The tiles beneath my feet are ice now, burning cold that makes my toes curl and cramp. 200 Mississippi. That's too many. I've been counting too long. The reflection raises its hand. My hand, but moving independently, and presses its palm against the glass from the inside. I watch frost spread from the point of contact, delicate patterns of ice crystals blooming across the mirror's surface. The cold radiates outward, and I can feel it even though I'm standing 3 feet away. My breath comes out in visible puffs now, each exhale a small ghost that dissipates into the increasingly frigid air. I should run. Every instinct screams at me to turn around, to flee this bathroom, this house, this moment. But my feet have grown roots, burrowing through the tiles and into the foundation below. I can feel them spreading, branching out like a nervous system made of wood and fear, anchoring me to this spot, where I must watch, must witness whatever is about to happen. The smile in the mirror speaks without moving its lips. The words come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the pipes, the walls, the very air itself. You've been counting wrong all these years. My toothbrush falls from my numb fingers, clattering on the tiles with a sound like breaking bones. In the mirror, the reflection catches its toothbrush before it falls, betwirling it between fingers that move with impossible grace. Those fingers are longer now, or perhaps they always were, and I never noticed. They have too many joints, bending in directions that make my eyes water to follow. 300 Mississippi. The numbers keep coming even though I'm not counting anymore. They're counting themselves, marking time that moves differently here in this bathroom that isn't quite my bathroom anymore. The frost on the mirror forms patterns, not random but deliberate, letters maybe, or symbols from an alphabet I've never seen but somehow almost remember. They pulse with a faint light, like bioluminescent organisms trapped beneath ice. I lean closer despite myself, drawn by a curiosity that feels foreign in my mind. The reflection leans closer too, but from its side, moving independently. We're face to face now, separated only by this thin barrier of glass and frost, and whatever reality means anymore. I can smell its breath, my breath, but not, seeping through the mirror. It smells like peppermint and copper, and something else, something old and patient and waiting. Every night, it says without speaking, you stand here. Every night, you count, but you never ask what you're counting down to. 400 Mississippi. The number feels significant, like a threshold about to be crossed. The lights flicker again, and in that split second of darkness, I feel something shift. When the light returns, everything looks the same, but feels different. Like the world has been photocopied one too many times, losing a bit of definition with each iteration. The bathroom tiles have a pattern I don't remember, spirals that make my vision swim when I try to focus on them. The reflection stops smiling. Its face goes slack, neutral, waiting. Then it does something that makes my blood freeze. It turns around and walks away from the mirror, disappearing into the depths of the reflected bathroom. I'm left staring at an empty room in the glass, a bathroom with no one in it, even though I'm still standing right here. Or am I? I look down at my hands. They look like my hands, feel like my hands. But didn't they always have that small scar on the left thumb? Or was it the right? The fluorescent light buzzes louder. A mosquito whine that burrows into my thoughts and scatters them like startled birds. 500 Mississippi. The counting won't stop. I touch my face, feeling for the smile that isn't there. My fingers trace the outline of my lips, checking their boundaries, their limits. Normal. Everything feels normal. But in the mirror, the empty bathroom starts to fog up, as if someone invisible is breathing on it from the other side. Words appear in the condensation, written by an unseen finger. Your turn to be the reflection. The bathroom door behind me clicks. Locked. I didn't lock it. I never lock it. But I can hear the mechanism engaging, metal sliding into place with a finality that makes my chest tighten. The doorknob rattles once, twice, then goes still. 600 Mississippi. The pipes have gone silent. The absence of their groaning is somehow worse than the noise, a vacuum that makes my ears ring with phantom sounds. I can hear my heartbeat now, but it's coming from the wrong direction. Not from my chest, but from behind the mirror. A rhythmic thumping like someone knocking to be let in or out. I press my own hand against the mirror, matching the place where the reflection touched it. The glass is warm, fever, hot, pulsing with that alien heartbeat. The frost melts instantly, running down in rivulets that look too much like tears or blood or both. My palm print remains, perfect and clear, and through it I can see into the reflected bathroom. There's someone in there now, standing exactly where I'm standing, wearing my pajamas, my face, my expression of dawning horror. But it's not me. It can't be me, because I'm here, aren't I? I'm the real one. I've always been the real one, haven't I? 700 Mississippi. The reflection. The other me, the imposter, the original, raises its hand and waves. A slow, deliberate gesture that I feel my own hand wanting to mirror. My muscles twitch, fighting against my will, trying to complete the movement. I clench my fist instead, nails digging crescents into my palm. You can't stay on both sides forever. It mouths, and somehow I can read its lips perfectly, even though they're my lips, saying words I'm not saying. Choose. The 800 Mississippi. The bathroom tile beneath my feet cracks. A single line at first, then spreading like a web, like the mirror is about to shatter, but in reverse. The floor breaking instead of the glass. Through the cracks, I see nothing. Not the apartment below, not pipes or foundation, but an absolute absence of anything. A void that makes my eyes hurt to perceive. The me in the mirror sits down on the closed toilet lid, casual and patient. It picks up a magazine from the counter. A magazine I don't own, have never seen, and starts reading. Occasionally it glances up at me, checking to see if I'm still there, still watching, still counting. 900 Mississippi. My legs are shaking now, muscles cramping from standing in the same position for how long? Minutes, hours. The clock on the bathroom wall has stopped, its hands frozen at 11:47. But which 11:47? Tonight's? Last night's? Every night's. The reflection yawns, stretches, stands up. It walks to the mirror again, so close I can see the pores in its skin, the individual eyelashes, the flecks of color in its irises that spell out words in a language I almost understand. It leans forward until its forehead touches the glass. 1,000 Mississippi. We say in unison, my voice and its voice harmonizing in a way that makes the mirror vibrate. The glass cracks, not shatters, just a single, perfect line running from top to bottom, dividing the reflection in half. Through the crack, something seeps, not light or darkness, but possibility. The chance that both of us are real, the chance that neither of us is. I reach out, fingers trembling, and touch the crack. It's sharp, sharper than it should be, and I feel warm blood well up from the cut. The blood drops onto the white tile, each drop sounding like a thunderclap in the silence. The reflection mirrors my movement perfectly now, its own finger bleeding, its own blood dropping. But when I look down, the tiles on my side are clean. It's only in the mirror that the blood pools, spreading in patterns that look almost like letters, almost like a message I'm supposed to read. 1,100 Mississippi. Make a choice, the reflection says, and this time its lips move. Stay here counting forever, or step through and become what you've always been watching. The crack widens just enough for fingers to slip through, for hands to grasp edges, for bodies to exchange places, if they were brave enough, or foolish enough, or desperate enough to try. 1,200 Mississippi. I can't remember why I came into the bathroom. Can't remember if I've brushed my teeth yet, or if that was the plan. The toothbrush on the floor looks unfamiliar, like something from someone else's life. The face in the mirror, both faces now, as the crack has created two of everything. Watch me with eyes that might be concerned, or might be hungry, or might be both. 1,300 Mississippi. My hand moves without my permission, reaching for the crack. The reflection's hand reaches too from its side. Our fingers are about to touch, about to meet in that impossible space between real and reflection, between counting and counted, between one Mississippi and the next. 1,400. The lights go out. In the darkness, I hear breathing that isn't mine, or was mine, or was mine, or will be mine. The counting continues, but I can't tell anymore if it's coming from my throat, or from behind the glass, or from the walls themselves. The numbers blend together, losing meaning, becoming just sounds, just rhythm, just the heartbeat of something that has always been here, waiting for someone to count high enough to set it free. When the lights flicker back on, I'm looking at the mirror. My reflection looks normal, perfectly normal, except for the smile. That smile that's just a little too wide, a little too knowing, a little too much like it belongs to someone who's been counting much longer than 1,400 Mississippi. I try to stop smiling. The reflection doesn't even try. 1,500 Mississippi. 1,501 Mississippi. 1,502 Mississippi. The counting continues. It always continues. Every night, 3 minutes of brushing. Every night, 180 Mississippi. Every night, the same routine. Except tonight, I can't remember which side of the mirror I started on. And I'm not sure it matters anymore. Story 6. I discovered the account on a Thursday evening while mindlessly scrolling through Instagram. The way you do when your day has collapsed into the comfortable numbness of routine and you need something, anything, to fill the space between dinner and sleep. The username was TwindowWatcher47, and the account had no profile picture, no bio, no followers. But it had been posting photos. Dozens of them, all of me. The first image showed me sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open, coffee cup steaming beside my elbow. The angle was wrong for a selfie, wrong for any photo I might have taken myself. It had been shot from outside, through my window, with a kind of telephoto precision that suggested expensive equipment and deliberate intent. My hands shook as I scrolled through the feed. Photo after photo, a documentary of my private life captured through glass. Me cooking dinner, my face concentrated on chopping vegetables. Me watching television, my profile lit by the blue glow of the screen. Me reading in bed, my reading lamp creating a warm circle of light in the darkness beyond my window. Each image was time-stamped, posted just hours after it had been taken. The most recent was from this morning, me standing at my bedroom window in my robe, coffee in hand, looking out at the apartment building across the street. The very building, I realized with creeping horror, from which these photos had been taken. I screenshot everything before I could lose my nerve, then reported the account. Instagram's automated response promised they would review the content for violations of community standards, but offered no timeline for action, no immediate relief. I closed my laptop and walked to every window in my apartment, drawing the curtains with trembling fingers. But even with the fabric barrier between my life and the watching world, I could feel the weight of observation, the presence of eyes I couldn't see. Sleep that night was impossible. Every small sound, the settling of the building, the whisper of wind through the courtyard, the distant hum of traffic, might have been footsteps, might have been the soft click of a camera shutter, might have been someone getting closer to the glass that separated my privacy from their violation. The next morning, I called the police. The officer who took my statement was kind, but not particularly optimistic. Social media stalking cases are tricky. She explained, her voice professional but sympathetic. Unless there are direct threats or evidence of physical trespass, it's often treated as a civil matter. But we'll file a report, and if the behavior escalates. As if having a stranger photograph my most intimate moments wasn't already an escalation beyond what anyone should have to endure. I began researching the apartment building across from mine. A converted warehouse with large windows and multiple units facing my direction. Through property management companies and rental listings, I compiled a list of current tenants. Most were young professionals like myself, people who probably had no idea their building had become a surveillance platform. That evening, I positioned myself carefully out of sight and watched the building through a gap in my curtains. Lights came on in different units as residents returned from work. I saw glimpses of normal life. Someone cooking. Someone watching TV. Someone moving around their living space in the unconscious way people do when they believe they're unobserved. But in one unit on the 4th floor, I noticed something different. The lights remained off, but I could see the faint glow of electronic equipment, the kind of steady illumination that comes from camera displays and computer monitors. And positioned at the window, barely visible in the darkness, was what looked like the cylindrical outline of a telephoto lens. My phone buzzed with a notification. Instagram. Window Watcher 47 had posted a new photo. With hands that felt disconnected from my body, I opened the app. The image showed me from just moments before, peering through the gap in my curtains, my face tight with fear and concentration. The caption read, "She knows she's being watched now. The game changes." I dropped my phone and stumbled backward from the window. The game changes. This wasn't random stalking behavior. This was someone who enjoyed the fear, who was escalating precisely because they knew I was aware of them. I called the police again, then my landlord, then my closest friend, Sarah. The police promised to send someone to canvass the building across the street. My landlord offered to install better window coverings. Sarah insisted I come stay with her until this was resolved, but I couldn't leave. Running away would mean letting this person win, letting them drive me from my home, my sanctuary, the space where I had every right to exist without being watched and documented and reduced to a subject in someone's twisted photography project. Instead, I went shopping. I bought blackout curtains for every window, security cameras for my front door and fire escape, a telephoto lens of my own. If this person wanted to play games, I would play them too. That night, I set up my camera at the gap between the new curtains and waited. The unit on the 4th floor remained dark, but the equipment glow persisted. At 11:47 p.m., I saw movement. A figure adjusting something at the window, the angle of the camera, perhaps, or the focus. I took photo after photo, capturing what I could see of the surveillance setup, the silhouette of the person operating it. Then I created my own Instagram account, Watching the Watcher. My first post was a photo of their window, their equipment, their violation turned back on itself. The caption read, "Every stalker has a face. Every predator has an address. Every game has rules that work both ways." The response was immediate. Within minutes, Window Watcher 47 posted a new image, my apartment building from street level, taken just moments before. They were outside. They had left their observation post and were now on the ground, possibly in my building, possibly climbing the stairs to my floor. I called 911 and barricaded myself in my bathroom, the only room without windows. Through the door, I could hear my own heartbeat, the creak of floorboards that might have been settling, or might have been footsteps, the whisper of air that might have been wind, or might have been breathing. The police arrived 18 minutes later. They found no evidence of forced entry, no signs of intrusion. But they did canvass the building across the street and discovered something that made my blood turn to ice water. Unit 4C, where I had seen the surveillance equipment, was empty. Had been empty for 3 months. The utilities were disconnected. The windows were sealed. The equipment I had photographed didn't exist. The figure I had seen adjusting the camera was impossible. Yet the photos on Die Window Watcher 47 continued to appear, each one taken from an angle that suggested the exact window I had been watching. The police officer assigned to my case, Detective Morrison, was thorough in her confusion. The metadata on these photos shows they were taken with professional equipment, she said, scrolling through the images on her tablet. High-end camera telephoto lens, probably worth more than most people's cars. But there's no one in that unit. The building management confirmed it's been vacant since June. Then where are they coming from? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer would satisfy no one, least of all myself. Detective Morrison frowned at her tablet. That's what we need to figure out. But I was already figuring it out. In the way you solve puzzles, when the solution makes your skin crawl and your rational mind rebel against its own conclusions. That night, I sat in my darkened living room and watched the empty unit across the street. No lights, no movement, no signs of life. Yet at exactly 11:47 p.m., the same time every night, I realized a new photo appeared on the Window Watcher 47. This one showed me sitting in my chair, illuminated by the glow of my phone screen, staring across the street at the very window from which the photo had supposedly been taken. The reflection, in the glass of my own window, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was the faint outline of someone standing behind me, in my apartment, in my living room. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the room was empty. Just furniture and shadows, and the familiar geography of my own space. But the reflection had been clear, unmistakable. Someone had been standing directly behind my chair while I sat there, close enough to touch, close enough to breathe on my neck. I ran to the bathroom and locked the door, then called Detective Morrison from the safety of the windowless space. The photos aren't being taken from across the street. I whispered into the phone. They're being taken from inside my apartment. That's impossible, she said. We've checked your locks, your windows, or your fire escape. There's no evidence of entry. Then how do you explain the reflection? A pause. What reflection? I described what I'd seen, the figure standing behind me, captured in the window glass like a ghost made visible only through technology. Send me the photo, Detective Morrison said. I pulled up the Instagram post and screenshot it, then sent it to her number. A moment later, she called back. I don't see any reflection, she said carefully. Just you, sitting in your chair, looking out the window. But I could see it. Even now, looking at the screenshot on my phone, I could see the unmistakable outline of a person standing behind me, their face obscured by shadow, but their presence undeniable. You don't see anyone else in the photo? No, she said, and her tone had shifted to the careful neutral voice people use when they think you might be having a breakdown. Just you. After she hung up, I sat on my bathroom floor and stared at the screenshot. The figure was still there, still standing behind me, still watching me watch myself being watched. I began to understand that whatever was happening to me existed in spaces between certainty and doubt. Between what could be documented and what could only be experienced. The photos were real. I could see them, screenshot them, report them. But the source of the photos existed in a dimension that surveillance equipment couldn't capture, that police reports couldn't quantify, that other people couldn't perceive. I was being stalked by something that might not technically exist, documented by equipment that had no physical presence, observed by eyes that left no forensic evidence of their watching. The thought should have driven me deeper into panic. Instead, it brought an odd kind of clarity. If the rules of this harassment existed outside normal reality, then perhaps my response could as well. I returned to my living room and positioned myself in the exact spot where the photo had been taken. Then I spoke to the empty air behind me. I know you're there, I said quietly. I know you're listening. I know you've been watching me for weeks, maybe months, taking photos of my private moments and posting them online. The apartment was silent, but silence can have texture, weight, intention. This silence was thick with attention. What do you want? I asked. My phone buzzed. A new post on Window Watcher 47. The image showed me from my current position, speaking to the apparently empty room. But in this photo, the reflection in the window was clearer, more detailed. The figure behind me had a face now pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to hold too much darkness. The caption read, "She wants to know what I want." I want her to understand that privacy is an illusion. I want her to know that walls are transparent, that windows work both ways. That being alone doesn't mean being unobserved. I want her to learn that home is not a sanctuary, but a display case. I screenshot the post and stared at the reflection, at the face that was becoming more defined with each photo, more human and therefore more terrifying. "Why me?" I whispered to the room. Another post appeared immediately. The photo showed me holding my phone. The screenshot visible on my screen, a recursive loop of watching and being watched. The reflection was clearer still. The face behind me, now detailed enough that I could see the slight smile playing at the corners of its mouth. Because you live your life as if no one is watching. Because you believe in the fiction of private spaces. Because you needed to learn that observation is the natural state of existence. That every moment is performed whether you know it or not. I stood up slowly and turned around. The room remained empty. But the air held that electric quality that precedes thunderstorms, that pressure that builds when two weather systems collide. "Show yourself," I said. My phone buzzed again. This time, the photo wasn't taken from across the room. It was taken from directly in front of me, at eye level, as if someone were standing inches away, holding the camera between us. But there was no one there. The photo showed my face, pale and terrified, with the living room behind me. And reflected in my own eyes, the dark pupils dilated with fear, was the face of the photographer. Not behind me this time, but in front of me, occupying the same space I was looking at, existing in the reflection of my own vision. I am still in my apartment. I have not moved, have not fled, have not called for help again, because I finally understand the nature of the game being played. The rules that govern this particular violation. The photos continue to appear. Every night at 11:47 p.m., a new image documenting my existence, capturing moments I don't remember posing for, angles I couldn't have achieved alone. But now I know where they're coming from. The reflection in every surface, the shadow that follows every movement, the part of being observed that creates the observer. I am taking pictures of myself through eyes that are not my own, with hands that exist only in the spaces between watching and being watched. The account key window watcher, 47, belongs to me. The photos are mine. The violation is self-inflicted, the stalker self-created, the fear self-sustaining. In learning that I was never truly alone, I discovered that I was never truly accompanied either. There is only the watching, and the being watched, and the terrible realization that they might be the same thing. The curtains remain drawn. The camera continues to click, and at 11:47 p.m. each night, I post another photo of myself, taken from the perspective of the person I'm terrified to be alone with. The person who has been with me all along. The person who knows exactly how to find the angles that reveal everything I thought I could hide. Click. Welcome to the other side of the window. The view is perfect from here. Story 7. The sign appeared 3 days after I moved to Millbrook. I'd chosen this small town specifically for its quietness, its distance from the urban chaos I'd grown tired of, and its remarkably affordable rent. The house I'd inherited from my great aunt sat on the edge of town, surrounded by old oak trees and a sense of peaceful isolation that had initially felt like a gift. The sign was placed at the main intersection. Where Elm Street crossed Main, a simple wooden post with neat black lettering on a white background, the kind of official signage you'd expect from a town council or local government office. It read, TWNRDMINCE 847DB AFDAR SONSET. Dio Naut Raspanda. Kenokli ATAURDORVO EOLATIOS Subje Ishiti TO Penel Tia BYORDR of Melov Alabrook TWNTONCIL. I first noticed it on my morning walk to the small general store that served as the town's primary commercial establishment. The sign's placement was prominent enough that every resident and visitor would see it. Positioned where the town's only traffic light cast its changing colors across the weathered wood. The phrasing struck me as odd. Most town ordinances dealt with parking, noise levels, or property maintenance, practical matters that helped neighbors coexist peacefully. But this felt different, more like a warning than a regulation. At the general store, I mentioned the sign to Martha, the elderly woman who ran the register and seemed to know everyone in town. "Oh, that," she said, not looking up from counting change. Been meaning to put that up for years. Just got around to it, I suppose. What's it about? The knocking thing. She paused in her counting and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're new here, aren't you? Sarah's great niece. The one who inherited the old place on Sycamore Lane." I nodded, noting how she'd deflected my question with one of her own. "Well," she continued, "every place has its own way of doing things. You'll get used to our little customs." Her tone suggested the conversation was over, but something in her eyes, a quick, almost furtive glance toward the store's front window, made me think the sign was more than just a local custom. That evening, I found myself paying more attention to the sounds around my house as the sun set. The old place had its own audio signature, the settling of wooden beams, the whisper of wind through the oak trees, the distant hum of the refrigerator and water heater. Normal sounds, the kind you learn to filter out after a few nights in a new place. But as darkness settled completely over the town, I noticed something else. The usual evening sounds: dogs barking, televisions playing. The occasional car passing on the road gradually faded to nothing. By 9 o'clock, Millbrook was quieter than any place I'd ever lived. Not the peaceful quiet of a small town winding down for the evening, but an absolute silence that felt somehow deliberate. Around 10:30, I heard the first knock. 3 measured raps on my front door, neither urgent nor casual, but perfectly spaced and precisely executed. The sound was exactly what you'd expect from a neighbor stopping by, perhaps to introduce themselves or borrow a cup of sugar. I moved toward the front door, already forming polite greetings in my mind when I remembered the sign. After sunset, I do not respond to knocking at your door. I stopped in the middle of my living room, suddenly uncertain. It was a ridiculous ordinance. Who makes laws about answering your own door? But Martha's expression at the general store and the strange quality of the evening silence made me hesitate. The knocking came again. 3 raps, identical to the first set in timing and intensity. Not impatient, not frustrated, but persistent in a way that suggested the knocker would wait as long as necessary. I moved to the front window and carefully separated the curtains to peer outside. The porch light illuminated the small covered area in front of my door, but I could see no one there. The wooden boards of the porch were empty, as was the gravel driveway leading up to the house. But the knocking continued. 3 raps. Pause. 3 raps. Pause. The rhythm was hypnotic in its consistency, like a metronome keeping time for something I couldn't see. I let the curtains fall back into place and stepped away from the window. The smart thing, the rational thing, would be to simply open the door and greet whoever was there. But the absolute emptiness of the porch, combined with the persistence of the knocking, created a wrongness that settled deep in my stomach like cold water. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was even more profound than before, as though the sound had been absorbing ambient noise, and its absence left behind a vacuum. I stood in my living room, barely breathing, listening for footsteps on the gravel, a car door closing, any indication that my visitor had departed. Instead, I heard knocking at the back door. The same rhythm, the same measured spacing, the same perfectly controlled intensity. But now it was coming from the kitchen, from the small covered patio that overlooked my backyard. This time, I didn't approach the door. I remained in the living room, counting the repetitions, trying to understand the pattern. After exactly 12 sets of 3 knocks, it stopped. Then, immediately, the knocking resumed at the side door, the small entrance near the laundry room that I'd barely noticed during my first walk through of the house. 12 more sets, then silence, then knocking at what sounded like the basement access door. Then a pause, and the knocking returned to the front door, beginning the cycle again. My house was being circled. I sat down heavily in my armchair, trying to process what was happening. Someone or something was moving around my house, knocking on each door in sequence. 12 times at each entrance, over and over in a precise, mechanical pattern. But I'd seen the front porch. It was empty, and the back patio was elevated, with no easy way to access it without a ladder. The side door opened onto a narrow space between my house and the neighbor's fence, barely wide enough for a person to stand. Yet the knocking continued, making its slow circuit of my home, like a clock measuring time in sounds instead of seconds. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was teenagers playing a prank, using some kind of remote device to create the knocking sounds. Or maybe it was an animal, raccoons, maybe. Or some other nocturnal creature whose claws on wood could sound like knocking. If you were already nervous about being in a new place. But the precision of it, the exact timing, and identical intensity at each door, suggested something far more deliberate than animal activity or teenage mischief. The first circuit took exactly 20 minutes. I timed it on my phone, counting each set of knocks, marking the transitions from door to door. 20 minutes for the complete cycle. Then it began again, identical in every detail. By midnight, I'd witnessed 3 complete circuits. The pattern never varied, never accelerated or slowed, never showed any sign of frustration or fatigue. Whatever was making the sounds had the patience and consistency of a machine. At 12:30, it stopped entirely. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of waiting. I remained in my chair for another hour, listening for any indication that my midnight visitor had returned, but heard nothing except the normal sounds of an old house settling for the night. The next morning, I examined the areas around each door carefully. The ground near the front and back entrances showed no footprints, despite the soft earth that should have captured even the lightest step. The narrow space beside the house was undisturbed, with spider webs stretched across it that would have been broken by anyone trying to reach the side door. Most puzzling of all, the basement access door, an old wooden structure that led to the cellar from the outside, was covered in a layer of dust and fallen leaves that clearly hadn't been disturbed in months. Yet I'd heard knocking from each location, as clear and distinct, as if I'd been standing next to the person making the sounds. At the general store, I tried again to get information from Martha. That ordinance, I said, purchasing my morning coffee and a local newspaper. The one about not answering doors after dark. How long has that been in effect? She looked at me with the same unreadable expression from the day before. Long as I can remember, maybe longer. But what's the reason for it? What happens if you answer? Rules are rules, she said simply. Town's gotten along just fine following them. No point in changing things that work. But I noticed that she glanced toward the front window again, her eyes focusing on something beyond the glass with an intensity that suggested more than casual observation. When I turned to look, I saw nothing unusual, just the quiet main street, a few parked cars, and the official sign with its stark warning about nighttime visitors. The second night, the knocking started earlier. This time, I was ready. I'd positioned myself in the kitchen with a clear view of the back door, my phone camera recording, determined to capture whatever was creating the sounds. At exactly 9:45, the knocking began at the front door. Through the kitchen window, I watched the back patio. When the knocking moved to the back door, right on schedule, after 12 sets at the front, I saw nothing. The patio remained empty, illuminated by the motion, sensor light that had triggered when nothing had apparently approached the door. But the knocking was unmistakably real, coming from directly outside the kitchen. I could see the door itself. I could hear the sound of knuckles or something similar striking the wood. Could even see the slight vibration of the door in its frame with each impact. The motion sensor light stayed on throughout the knocking at the back door, suggesting that something was there, something large enough and warm enough to trigger the sensor. But the patio remained visibly empty. When I reviewed the phone recording later, the knocking was clearly audible, but the video showed nothing but an empty patio and a door that vibrated without any visible cause. The third night, I decided to test the ordnance directly. I prepared carefully, positioning myself near the front door with a chain lock that would allow me to open it slightly while maintaining some security. When the knocking began its familiar pattern, I waited through the first 11 sets, then approached the door during the pause before the final set. "Who's there?" I called through the heavy wooden door. The knocking stopped immediately, not just at the front door, but everywhere. The entire circuit ceased, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I waited, but the knocking didn't resume. Whatever I'd interrupted, my violation of the town ordinance had ended it entirely. The silence stretched on, and gradually, I became aware of other sounds returning to the night. Distant traffic from the highway, the faint hum of electrical transformers, the soft whisper of wind through the oak trees. Normal sounds that I only noticed because of their absence during the knocking. But underneath those returning sounds, I heard something else. Footsteps on gravel, moving away from my house. Not the hurried steps of someone retreating, but a slow, measured pace that suggested disappointment rather than alarm. I looked through the peephole, but saw nothing. The footsteps continued, growing fainter, but maintaining their deliberate rhythm, until they faded entirely into the distance. The fourth morning, Martha wasn't at the general store. Instead, a younger woman I hadn't met was behind the register. Someone who might have been Martha's daughter or niece, with the same general build and similar facial features. "Where's Martha?" I asked, selecting my usual coffee and newspaper. The woman looked at me blankly. "I'm sorry." "Who?" "Martha, the woman who usually runs the register. Older lady, gray hair. Been here every day since I moved to town." "I think you must be confused," she said politely. "I'm Linda. I've been running this store for about 15 years now. There's no Martha here." I stared at her, trying to process the impossibility of what she was saying. Martha had been here every day. We'd had conversations about the town, about the ordinance, about my great-aunt's house. She'd known details about my family, about when I'd arrived, about where I was living. "Maybe you're thinking of someone from another store," Linda suggested helpfully. "There's a Martha who runs the hardware store over in Riverside, about 20 minutes east of here. I paid for my items and left without pushing the issue further. But the wrongness of it followed me home like a shadow. People don't simply stop existing. Stores don't change hands overnight. And I couldn't have imagined detailed conversations with someone who apparently had never been there. That evening, I walked to the town's main intersection to look at the ordnance sign again. It was still there, positioned exactly where I remembered it. with the same neat lettering and official appearance. But something about it looked different in the evening light. The wood looked newer, as though it had been recently installed. The lettering appeared fresh, without the slight fading I remembered from my first few days in town. And at the bottom, in smaller text I was sure hadn't been there before, was an addition. Viowe ounds was walla resulti einra imamovilla for to or double to recordes. I read it 3 times, trying to understand what removal from town records could mean in practical terms. A fine, eviction, some kind of administrative penalty that would affect my ability to live here. But standing there in the growing darkness, with the first stars appearing in the clear sky above Millbrook, I began to suspect it meant something far more literal and far more final. The knocking didn't come that night, or the night after. Instead, my house was surrounded by a different kind of attention, not the mechanical precision of repeated knocking, but the sense of being observed, evaluated, perhaps judged. I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, figures that vanished when I turned to look directly at them, shadows that moved independently of their supposed sources, sounds that suggested footsteps circling the house, but much more quietly than before, as though whatever was watching me had learned to move with greater stealth. On the 7th night, the knocking returned, but the pattern had changed. Instead of beginning at the front door, it started at all 4 entrances simultaneously. The same measured rhythm, the same precise timing, but now overlapping in a complex polyrhythm that created harmonics and resonances that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the house. The sound was hypnotic and somehow musical, like a percussion ensemble playing a piece written specifically for houses and the people who lived in them. I found myself swaying slightly to the rhythm, my heartbeat gradually synchronizing with the overlapping patterns of knocks. It was beautiful in a way that made me want to open all the doors at once, to invite whatever was creating this complex symphony to come inside and continue the performance in my living room. I caught myself with my hand on the front door's deadbolt, already turning it toward the unlocked position. The music of the knocking had drawn me forward, without conscious decision, and only the sudden realization of what I was about to do snapped me back to awareness. I jerked my hand away from the lock and stepped backward, my heart racing not from fear, but from the lingering desire to complete the action, to open the door and see what waited beyond it. The knocking continued for exactly 1 hour, then stopped all at once, leaving behind a silence that felt empty and hollow after the richness of the overlapping rhythms. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my living room with every light in the house turned on, trying to understand what was happening to me and to this town that seemed to be changing around me day by day. The next morning, I drove to the county seat to research Millbrook's history. The small library had a local history section with records dating back to the town's founding in 1847. What I found didn't comfort me. Millbrook had a pattern of population fluctuations that defied normal demographic trends. Every few years, the census records showed sudden drops in population, not the gradual decline you'd expect from economic hardship or young people leaving for larger cities, but sharp, immediate reductions that suggested entire families had simply vanished between one count and the next. The town ordinances were particularly interesting. Ordinance 8247B, the regulation about not answering doors after dark, had been enacted and repealed dozens of times throughout the town's history. Sometimes it appeared in the records for only a few months, before disappearing entirely. Sometimes it remained in effect for years, before being quietly removed. But it always came back. And in the census data following each reenactment of the ordinance, there were always population drops. Small ones, usually just a few individuals or single families, but consistent enough to create a clear pattern over more than a century of records. People who violated the rule simply stopped existing in the town's official documentation. I'm writing this on my 9th night in Millbrook. The knocking has evolved again, becoming more complex, more musical, more irresistibly compelling. Last night, I found myself standing outside my own front door, having unlocked and opened it without any memory of deciding to do so. Only the sight of the empty porch, illuminated by my motion, sends a light, but clearly vacant, kept me from stepping outside to greet whatever had been calling to me with its percussion symphony. I closed the door quickly and re-locked it. But I could feel something watching me through the wood, something that had been very close to achieving whatever it was trying to accomplish. Tonight, the knocking is starting earlier. I can hear it beginning as I write this, still an hour before sunset. Still technically within the safe hours when Town Ordinance 847B doesn't apply. But I don't think the rules matter anymore. I think I've moved beyond the protection of ordinances and local customs into something more personal, more direct. The knocking has my rhythm now. It matches my heartbeat exactly, speeds up when I'm anxious, slows down when I try to calm myself. Whatever is out there has learned to speak my language, to communicate in the tempo of my own pulse. And I'm beginning to understand that it's not trying to get into my house. It's trying to get me to come outside. The pattern is almost complete now. Soon, I think, I'll join Martha and all the others who have discovered that some rules in small towns aren't suggestions or customs, but survival instructions. The knocking is getting louder, more insistent, and I can feel my feet moving toward the door, following a rhythm that has become as familiar as my own breathing. Maybe that's what happens when you don't respond to the knocking after dark. Eventually, you become part of it. The door is opening now. I can see stars outside, beautiful and clear in the country darkness. And I can see figures waiting on my porch, their faces kind and welcoming, their hands extended in greeting. They look like neighbors. They look like friends. They look like they've been waiting for me to join them for a very long time. The knocking has stopped. It's time to go. Story 8. I had always found solace in the forest, behind my grandmother's cabin, especially during times when the world felt too heavy to carry alone. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 days ago, and I needed the kind of silence that only came from being surrounded by trees, older than my problems, older than my marriage, older than the small disappointments that had accumulated into something too large to ignore. The hiking trail was familiar beneath my feet. I'd walked it countless times as a child. Following my grandmother's steady pace, as she pointed out medicinal plants and told stories about the families of deer that lived in the deeper woods. Now, 20 years later, I was walking it alone. My grandmother 2 years buried, and the cabin standing empty, except for my occasional retreats into solitude. The October air was crisp and thin, carrying the scent of decomposing leaves and the distant promise of winter. My footsteps made a soft percussion against the packed earth of the trail, punctuated by the occasional crack of a twig or the rustle of some small creature moving through the underbrush. The sound was rhythmic, almost meditative, and for the first time in weeks, I felt my shoulders beginning to relax. About a mile into the woods, I reached the clearing that had always been my favorite destination, a rough circle of grass, surrounded by towering pines, with a fallen log that made a perfect bench for contemplation. The canopy opened here, allowing shafts of afternoon sunlight to filter down in golden columns that danced with dust motes and the occasional flutter of a falling leaf. I sat on the log and closed my eyes, letting the sounds of the forest wash over me. The whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant tap, tap, tap of a woodpecker, the soft chirping of birds preparing for their southern migration. It was a symphony I'd been listening to since childhood, one that never failed to remind me that the world was larger and more enduring than any single human sorrow. After a while, I decided to test something I'd always loved about this particular spot. The clearing was situated in such a way that sounds echoed perfectly. My grandmother had shown me this when I was 7, encouraging me to call out and listen for the forest to call back. It was a simple pleasure, but one that had never lost its magic. I cupped my hands around my mouth and called out my own name, Sarah. The echo came back immediately, crisp and clear.
Sarah?
The trees caught the sound and bounced it back to me, a perfect reflection of my voice, returning from the depths of the forest. I smiled, remembering how delighted I'd been as a child to hear my name spoken back to me by the woods themselves. I called out again, louder this time, Sarah. But the echo that returned made my blood run cold. Michael. I sat perfectly still, listening to the sound fade into the rustling of leaves, wondering if I'd misheard. There must have been some acoustic trick, some way the wind had distorted the returning sound. I waited a full minute, then called out again, more carefully this time, making sure to pronounce each syllable clearly. Sarah! The echo came back distinct and unmistakable. Michael. My heart began to beat faster, that hollow, echoing rhythm that comes with the sudden realization that something is very wrong. I stood up from the log and called out again, shouting this time.
Sarah! Michael!
The voice was my own. I could recognize the particular timbre, the accent patterns, the way I shaped vowels. But it was speaking a name that wasn't mine, a name that belonged to someone else entirely. Someone I'd never met, as far as I knew. I walked to the other side of the clearing and tried again from a different position, thinking maybe the acoustics were playing tricks based on where I was standing. But no matter where I positioned myself, no matter how I called out my name, the echo that returned was always the same. Michael. I tried other words, other sounds, testing the boundaries of this impossible phenomenon. When I shouted, "Hello," the echo returned. "Hello." Perfectly normal.
When I called out, "Testing,"
it came back as testing. But every time I said my own name, the forest replied with that other name, that stranger's name, as if the trees themselves were insisting on a different identity for me. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe there was someone else in the woods, someone playing a prank or coincidentally calling out at the same moment I was. But the voice was too perfectly timed, too exactly my own voice, just wrong. I spent the next hour experimenting, calling out from different spots, trying different volumes and inflections. The results were always the same. My name went in, Michael came out, spoken in my own voice, but somehow not by me. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, I finally gave up and started the hike back to the cabin, my mind churning with questions that had no reasonable answers. The walk back seemed longer than usual, perhaps because I was hyper-aware of every sound, every rustle and crack and whisper of wind. Several times I stopped, thinking I heard footsteps behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing but empty trail and swaying trees. That night, I lay in my grandmother's old bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the forest settling into darkness. The cabin creaked and sighed around me, and every noise seemed amplified by my heightened state of awareness. I kept thinking about that name, Michael, and wondering who he was, why the echo of my voice insisted on calling him instead of me. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because I was awakened sometime, in the deep hours of the night, by the sound of someone calling my name. Not Michael, my actual name, Sarah, carried on the night air like a prayer or a plea. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering, and listened. The calling came again, distant but unmistakable.
Sarah!
It was coming from the direction of the forest, from somewhere deep in the woods beyond the cabin's small yard. Without quite knowing why, I found myself getting dressed, pulling on my hiking boots and walking out into the night. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver and deep shadow, and the path to the clearing was visible enough to navigate by its light. The calling continued, always from ahead of me, always just far enough away to remain mysterious.
Sarah!
Sarah! The voice grew clearer as I approached the clearing. And, with a chill of recognition, I realized it was my own voice calling my name. But I wasn't speaking. I was walking silently through the forest, following the sound of myself, calling to myself, drawn by something I couldn't name or understand. When I reached the clearing, the calling stopped. The space was empty, bathed in moonlight, perfectly still except for the gentle sway of tree branches in the night breeze. I stood at the edge of the open space, suddenly afraid to enter it. Afraid of what might happen if I called out in this nocturnal version of the place that had given me such strange echoes. But curiosity overrode caution, as it always does. I stepped into the center of the clearing and called out softly, "Sarah." The echo that returned was different this time. Still my voice, still the wrong name. But there was something else woven into the sound, a quality of distance that seemed to stretch beyond the physical space of the forest. The voice that said, "Michael," seemed to come from very far away, as if it were traveling across not just miles, but years, decades, entire lifetimes. "Michael." I called again, louder. "Sarah! Michael!" came the reply. But this time I heard something else in the echo, something that made my skin prickle with recognition. There was desperation in the voice, a longing that matched the ache in my own chest, the emptiness that had driven me to seek solitude in these familiar woods. "Who are you?" I called out, abandoning my name for a question. "Who are you?" The echo returned, perfectly normal, using my own words. But somehow it didn't sound like an echo anymore. It sounded like a response. I spent the next hour in conversation with whatever was reflecting my voice back to me, learning the rules of this strange communication. Direct questions echoed normally. Statements of fact returned as statements of fact. But names were different. My name became Michael, and I began to suspect that somewhere, in another clearing in another forest, someone named Michael was calling out his own name, and hearing it returned as Sarah. As dawn approached, I asked the question that had been building in my mind all night. "Are you lost too? Are you lost too?" came the reply, but there was an inflection to it, a tone that suggested not just an echo but an answer, an acknowledgement. A yes whispered across whatever impossible distance separated us. I left the forest as the sun was rising, my mind struggling to process what I'd experienced. Over the following days, I found myself researching echoes, acoustics, the physics of sound reflection. I read about atmospheric conditions that might distort returning sounds, about the way geographic features could bend and shape audio in unexpected ways. But nothing I learned could explain what had happened in that clearing. More troubling was the way the experience had affected me. The loneliness I'd come to the forest to escape had intensified, but it had also changed character. Instead of feeling alone in the world, I felt alone but not solitary. There was a sense of connection to something or someone just out of reach, a presence that existed in the spaces between my words, and their distorted returns. I began visiting the clearing regularly, always at night, always drawn by the possibility of that strange communion. The conversations, if they could be called that, became longer, more complex. I learned to communicate through careful phrasing, using the forest's tendency to echo everything except names to build a kind of code, a language of implication and suggestion. I ended something important recently, I would say, and I ended something important recently would come back, but with a weight to it that suggested shared experience, mutual understanding. The silence afterward is the hardest part. I would continue, and the echo would agree. The silence afterward is the hardest part. Through this strange dialogue, I began to piece together the outlines of another life, another person dealing with their own losses and transitions. Michael, whoever he was, seemed to be experiencing something parallel to my own journey through the aftermath of significant change. His echoes carried the same note of sadness, the same sense of searching for meaning in the wake of something that had ended. One night in late October, I asked the question that had been haunting me. Do you think we'll ever find our way back? The echo that returned was different this time. Instead of my own voice reflecting my words, I heard something that sounded almost like a sob. I hope so. It was still my voice, but it carried an emotion that felt distinctly not my own, a desperation that was deeper and more raw than my own carefully managed grief. In that moment, I understood that I wasn't just hearing echoes. I was hearing another person, another consciousness, reaching across some impossible divide to touch mine. Michael, I whispered into the darkness, and for the first time, my echo came back correctly, Sarah. The clearing fell silent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, gradually, other sounds began to return, the whisper of wind, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. But the strange acoustic phenomenon that had allowed us to communicate was gone, leaving only normal echoes and normal silence. I never heard Michael's voice again, though I continued to visit the clearing throughout that autumn and into the winter. The echoes returned to their natural behavior, faithfully reflecting my words without alteration or commentary. But sometimes, in the quality of the silence that followed my calls, I thought I could sense a listening presence. Someone on the other side of whatever barrier had briefly dissolved between us. Spring came early that year, and with it, a gradual lifting of the grief that had driven me into the forest. I found myself visiting the clearing less frequently, drawn back to the world of the living, to new relationships and possibilities that I'd been too raw to consider during those dark months of winter. But I never forgot Michael, the stranger whose loneliness had somehow touched mine across whatever impossible distance separated us. I never learned who he was or where he lived, or what loss had driven him to call out his name to an empty forest. But in some fundamental way, knowing that he existed that somewhere, someone else was walking through their own dark woods, seeking their own echoes of connection, had made my own journey bearable. The last time I visited the clearing, it was to say goodbye. I was moving back to the city, leaving my grandmother's cabin and the solitude that had sheltered me during the hardest months of my life. I stood in the center of the moonlit space and called out one final time, "Thank you." The echo that returned was perfectly normal. "Thank you." But in the silence that followed, I could have sworn I heard another voice, faint as a whisper, carried on the night wind. "Thank you too." I walked back through the forest with tears on my cheeks, understanding finally that the greatest echoes aren't the ones that return our own voices to us, but the ones that carry someone else's voice to our ears, proof that we are not as alone as we sometimes believe, that our calls for connection are heard and answered, even when we can't see who's listening. Somewhere, in another forest in another part of the world, Michael is still calling out his name and hearing mine in return. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the world feels too large and empty, I find myself calling back. Story 9. The clock stopped ticking the day my grandfather died. I remember because the silence woke me from dreams of his weathered hands, winding the brass mechanism, the way he did every Sunday morning after church. For 73 years. That clock had marked time in the hallway of our family home. Its deep, resonant chimes counting out the hours like a wooden heartbeat. I inherited the house along with its contents. The faded wallpaper, the creaking stairs, the smell of pipe tobacco that lingered in the curtains long after the last bowl had been smoked. But it was the clock that dominated the entrance hall, its dark mahogany case stretching nearly to the ceiling. Its brass pendulum frozen behind etched glass like a held breath. It just needs winding. My cousin Sarah suggested during the estate cleanup. She was always practical, always looking for simple solutions to complex problems. But when I tried turning the key, nothing happened. The mechanism seemed to have locked itself in place, as if refusing to acknowledge any hand but grandfather's. The repair shop downtown quoted me $300 for a full restoration. These old Brookfield movements are temperamental. The clockmaker explained, his fingers tracing the ornate woodwork. Sometimes they just give up. But I can get her running again if you're willing to wait a few weeks. I was willing to wait. The house felt incomplete without that steady tick-tock. The way a person might feel incomplete without a pulse. I signed the work order and arranged for pickup, watching through the window as two men carefully loaded the clock into their van. The hallway looked naked without it, just empty wall and the ghost outline where it had stood for decades. But that night, something strange happened. I woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of chiming, deep, brass notes that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves, counting out the hour with the familiar rhythm I had known since childhood. 1, 2, 3. Then silence, heavy and expectant. I lay in bed, heart hammering, trying to rationalize what I had heard. Old houses make sounds, I told myself. Pipes settling, wood contracting, the nocturnal symphony of aging construction. But deep down, I knew the sound of our clock's chimes, as well as I knew my own voice. The next morning, I called the repair shop. "Did you by any chance work on our clock last night?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Haven't even looked at it yet." The clockmaker replied, "Being backed up with a rush job. Probably won't get to yours until next week." I spent that day trying to locate the source of the sound. I checked every timepiece in the house. The kitchen wall clock, the mantel clock in the living room, even the digital displays on the microwave and coffee maker. Nothing was programmed to chime on the hour, and certainly nothing produced the deep, brass tones I had heard. But I knew what I had heard. The chiming came again 3 nights later, at 2:43 a.m., according to my bedside clock. This time I was ready. Creeping down the darkened hallway with a flashlight, following the sound to its source. The chimes seemed to emanate from the empty space, where the grandfather clock had stood, as if the ghost of its presence continued to mark time in our absence. 1, 2, 3. The notes hung in the air like incense, rich and resonant, before fading into silence. I pressed my palm against the wall where the clock had been, feeling for vibration, for any physical explanation for what I was hearing. The wall was still and cold, but something about the space felt different, expectant, alive in a way that made the hair on my arm stand up. Over the next week, the chiming became regular. Always in the early morning hours, always when I was alone in the house. 3 chimes, no matter what time my bedside clock showed. I began to keep a notebook, documenting each occurrence, searching for patterns that might explain the phenomenon. It was my Aunt Helen who provided the first clue, though she didn't realize it at the time. "Your grandfather always said that clock was special," she mentioned during a phone conversation. Said it had a way of knowing things. Gave him the shivers sometimes, the way it would act up before. Well, before family troubles. "What do you mean, act up?" "Oh, you know how it was. The clock would start chiming at odd hours, or the chimes would sound different somehow. Your grandmother used to say it was the clock's way of preparing us, like it knew what was coming before we did." The memory clicked into place suddenly, vividly. I was 12 years old, staying at my grandparents' house during summer vacation. I had woken in the middle of the night to the sound of chiming. Not the regular hour chimes, but something irregular and urgent. The next morning, we received the phone call about my great-uncle's heart attack. It chimed 3 times the night before your grandmother died. Aunt Helen continued, her voice growing distant. "Your grandfather told me later he knew what it meant. Said the clock had been preparing him all week with those strange sounds. 3 chimes. Always 3 chimes." I hung up the phone with shaking hands and walked to the empty hallway, staring at the space where the clock had stood for so many years. Had it really been trying to tell us something all along? Had those midnight disruptions been warnings, prophecies encoded in brass and mahogany? The repair shop called the next afternoon. Got some strange news about your clock, the clockmaker said, his voice carrying a note of confusion. The mechanism is in perfect working order. Nothing wrong with it at all. But it won't start, won't even respond to winding. It's like it's waiting for something. Waiting for what? Don't rightly know. Sometimes old clocks develop personality quirks. Maybe it needs to be back in its original environment. Why don't you come pick it up? See if it'll start running once it's home. But I wasn't sure I wanted it back. The phantom chiming had grown stronger over the past few days, more insistent. 3 chimes at increasingly unpredictable hours, as if time itself was becoming unstable. I had started sleeping with earplugs, but the sound seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating directly in my bones. That night, I dreamed of my grandfather. He stood in the hallway beside his beloved clock, his hand resting on the brass pendulum case. "It's not broken," he said in the dream, his voice carrying the patient tone he used when explaining complex ideas to a child. "It's just waiting." Waiting for what? Grandpa. But he only smiled and touched the side of his nose, the gesture he always made when keeping a secret. The clock began to chime in the dream. But instead of 3 strikes, it counted endlessly, each note overlapping with the last, until the sound became a continuous brass symphony that filled every corner of the house. I woke to the sound of real chiming. 3 strikes, deep and resonant, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. But this time, something was different. The quality of the sound had changed, become more urgent, more immediate. I checked the times for 7:23 a.m. My phone rang before I could process what the chiming might mean. "Is this David?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "This is Dr. Martinez at Riverside Hospital. I'm calling about your Aunt Helen. She was brought in about an hour ago." The words seemed to come from a great distance. Heart attack. Stable but critical. Family should come immediately. I found myself nodding along, making appropriate responses. But part of my mind remained focused on those 3 chimes that had woken me. How had the clock known? How had its phantom presence reached across the city to warn me about a relative I spoke to perhaps once a month? I drove through empty pre-dawn streets to the hospital, my hands gripping the steering wheel as questions spiraled through my mind. Was this what my grandfather had lived with all those years? This terrible knowledge that came without warning or explanation. Had he spent decades listening to that clock count down the days of people he loved? Aunt Helen survived the night, then the week, then the long recovery that followed. But the pattern was established now, impossible to deny or ignore. The phantom clock had become a herald of family crisis, chiming its warning 3 strikes whenever someone in our bloodline faced their darkest hours. 3 chimes for my cousin Sarah's car accident. 3 chimes for my nephew's meningitis scare. 3 chimes for my mother's cancer diagnosis, delivered with brass precision at 12:15 a.m. on a Tuesday that seemed no different from any other. I retrieved the clock from the repair shop, though it remained as silent and still as a tombstone. The clockmaker had given up trying to understand its refusal to run. "Some things just can't be fixed," he said, shaking his head. Maybe it served its time, but I knew better. The clock hadn't stopped working. It had evolved beyond the need for gears and springs. It had become something else entirely. A bridge between the mechanical measurement of time and the deeper rhythms that govern life and death. I moved it back to its place in the hallway, where it stood like a sentinel, its hands frozen at 3:01, the exact time my grandfather had died. During daylight hours, it looked like any other antique, a beautiful but non-functional reminder of craftsmanship from a bygone era. But in the darkness it became something more. A guardian, a witness, a voice speaking truths too terrible for ordinary conversation. The phantom chiming continued, always 3 strikes, always preceding bad news by mere hours. I began to dread the sound, to lie awake listening for brass notes that might or might not come. Sleep became fractured, punctuated by the anxiety of waiting for warnings I couldn't ignore, but didn't want to hear. Months passed. I learned to live with the knowledge that my family's tragedies were marked by a clock that no longer existed in any physical sense, yet continued to function with supernatural precision. Friends noticed my increasing isolation, the way I jumped at unexpected sounds, the dark circles that seemed permanent fixtures under my eyes. "You look like you're waiting for bad news." My neighbor Mrs. Peterson observed one afternoon as I worked in the garden. She meant it kindly, but her words cut deeper than she could have known, because that's exactly what I was doing. Waiting, listening, preparing for the next crisis that would be announced by 3 deep chimes in the darkness. The worst part wasn't the warnings themselves, but the helplessness that followed. What good is prophecy if you can't change what's coming? What purpose does foreknowledge serve except to extend suffering, to transform surprise into extended dread? I began to understand why my grandfather had seemed so tired in his final years. Why he would sometimes stare at the clock with an expression of profound weariness. He had carried this burden for decades, listening to time itself whisper secrets about the people he loved. 6 months after the clock's resurrection as a phantom oracle, I received the call I had been unconsciously dreading. My mother's voice, small and frightened. "David, I think something's wrong with me." But for the first time since this all began, the phantom clock had been silent. No warning chimes. No brass prophecy echoing through the hallway at 3 a.m. Just the ordinary sounds of an old house settling into another ordinary night. I drove to my mother's house with something approaching hope. Maybe the clock's silence meant everything would be all right. Maybe the absence of chiming was itself a kind of good news. The diagnosis was swift and brutal pancreatic cancer, stage 4. weeks rather than months to live. That night, alone in my inherited house, I stood before the silent grandfather clock and whispered the questions that had been building in my chest for months. Why didn't you warn me? Why now, when it matters most, did you stay silent? But I think I already knew the answer. The clock had never been predicting death. It had been announcing the moments when hope died, when the fight became too difficult to continue, when families began the process of letting go. My mother, with her characteristic strength and stubbornness, had never given up hope. Even facing the worst diagnosis possible, some part of her remained convinced she would find a way through. The phantom clock, it seemed, respected that kind of courage. It honored the difference between medical facts and spiritual surrender. 3 weeks later, as I sat beside my mother's hospital bed, holding her hand, she turned to me with eyes that had accepted what was coming. "I'm tired. David," she whispered, "I think it's time to stop fighting." That night, at 3:17 a.m., the grandfather clock chimed for the last time. 3 deep, resonant notes that seemed to carry all the weight of family history, all the love and loss that had echoed through our bloodline for generations. My mother died peacefully 2 hours later, with the morning sun streaming through her hospital room windows. The phantom chiming never returned. The hallway fell silent. The ordinary, no longer haunted by brass prophecies or wooden warnings. I thought about selling the clock, or donating it to a museum where it might find new purpose as a curiosity rather than a burden. But I couldn't bring myself to let it go. It stands there still, hands frozen at the moment of my grandfather's passing. A testament to the idea that love transcends the boundaries between life and death, between the mechanical and the mystical. Sometimes, late at night when the house is particularly quiet, I think I can hear the ghost of its ticking. Not the warning chimes that marked our family's sorrows, but the steady, comforting rhythm that counted out 73 years of ordinary moments. Breakfast conversations and birthday parties, Sunday mornings and weekday evenings, the unremarkable beats that make up a life. I've come to understand that the clock's greatest gift wasn't its supernatural ability to predict tragedy. It was the way it marked all the ordinary time in between. The hours and days and years when nothing dramatic happened, when people simply lived and loved and went about their daily business. Those moments, I realize now, were the real treasure. The phantom chimes were just punctuation marks in a much longer story, one that continues even after the clock has fallen silent. Tonight, as I write these words, the clock stands watch in the hallway, its brass fittings catching the lamplight like closed eyes. I no longer fear what it might tell me about the future, because I've learned that the future will arrive regardless of what we know about it. What matters is the present moment. This breath, this heartbeat, this ordinary Tuesday night when nothing extraordinary is happening, and that itself is extraordinary enough. The clock keeps time in its own way now, measuring not minutes or hours, but the spaces between sorrows, the intervals of grace that make all the rest bearable. And in that silence, I finally hear what my grandfather always knew, that love itself is the most reliable timekeeper, marking each precious moment with the steady rhythm of caring hearts, long after all the clocks in the world have wound down and stopped. Story 10. I had always been a light sleeper, but lately I'd been waking up more tired than when I went to bed. That's why I downloaded the sleep tracking app, Sleepwatch Pro, with its promise of comprehensive monitoring and personalized insights. The reviews were glowing. Finally understand your sleep patterns. And life-changing sleep analysis. The setup was simple enough. I placed my phone on the nightstand, activated the app, and went to bed as usual. The interface was sleek and modern, with soft blue tones that were supposed to be calming. A small microphone icon pulsed gently in the corner, indicating that it was recording ambient sounds to analyze my sleep quality. The first few nights yielded exactly what I expected. The app showed my sleep cycles in neat graphs, marked my periods of deep sleep and REM with different colors, and noted the times when I tossed and turned. It even recorded snippets of sound, my occasional snore, the creak of the mattress when I shifted positions, the distant hum of the air conditioning unit. But on the fourth night, something changed. I woke up feeling more exhausted than ever, my throat slightly sore, as if I'd been talking for hours. When I checked the app, I found something that made my blood run cold. The audio recording was nearly 6 hours, long, much longer than usual, and the sound waves showed consistent patterns of vocal activity throughout the night. I put in my earbuds and started listening, fast forwarding through the familiar sounds of my evening routine. Then, around 11:47 p.m., just as I would have been falling into deep sleep, I heard my own voice. "Are you there?" I was saying, the words clear and distinct despite what should have been unconsciousness. My voice sounded different, somehow younger, more uncertain. There was a pause, filled only with the soft whisper of my breathing, and then I spoke again. "I know you can hear me." I sat up in bed, phone trembling in my hands. I had no memory of speaking during the night, no recollection of any dreams that might explain this nocturnal conversation. But there it was, recorded in perfect digital clarity, my voice, speaking words I didn't remember saying. I continued listening, my heart racing as the conversation unfolded. "I've been waiting," my recorded voice continued, and there was something plaintive about it, something that sounded almost like longing. "Every night, I wait for you to answer." Another pause, longer this time, filled with the soft rustling of sheets. Then, impossibly, I heard another voice respond. "I'm here," it said, and the blood drained from my face. It was also my voice, but different somehow, older, warier. The tone was exactly the same, the vocal patterns identical. But there was a quality to it that I didn't recognize, a depth, a resonance that didn't match the voice I heard when I spoke during my waking hours. I was afraid you wouldn't come. The first voice said, the one that sounded like my younger self. It's been so long since we talked. Time moves strangely here, the older voice replied. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like forever. I pulled the earbuds out, my hands shaking. This had to be some kind of glitch. Some error in the app's processing. Maybe it had picked up radio signals or crossed wires with another user's recording. There had to be a rational explanation, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voices were too clear, too distinct, too perfectly matched to my own vocal patterns. And there was something about the conversation, something about the way the words flowed, that felt familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. I forced myself to put the earbuds back in and continue listening. Do you remember the accident? The older voice was asking, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Do you remember what happened that night? There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of deep breathing. When my younger voice finally responded, it was barely above a whisper. I try not to think about it. But you do think about it. The older voice pressed gently. Every night, when you close your eyes, you see it happening again. Stop. My younger voice pleaded, and I could hear the distress in the tone. The way the words caught slightly, as if I were trying not to cry. I don't want to remember. You have to remember, the older voice said, and now there was an urgency to it, a desperate quality that made my chest tight with anxiety. It's the only way you'll understand. The only way you'll know why you're here. I don't understand, my younger voice said, and I found myself echoing the words out loud, sitting in my bed in the pale morning light. I don't understand any of this. The conversation continued, but the words became harder to make out, as if the speakers were moving away from the microphone. I could hear fragments mentions of a hospital, of bright lights and the smell of antiseptic, of someone calling my name over and over again. But the voices were fading, becoming whispers and then silence. I looked at the timestamp on the recording. The conversation had lasted for over an hour, but I could only make out about 10 minutes of actual dialogue. The rest was just breathing, the occasional rustle of movement, and once, near the end, what sounded like quiet sobbing. I didn't go to work that day. Instead, I sat in my living room, staring at my phone, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. I Googled everything I could think of sleep-talking disorders, apps that might malfunction and create false recordings, even paranormal explanations for voices appearing on electronic devices. Nothing I found came close to explaining the crystal, clear conversation between two versions of myself. That evening, I almost didn't activate the app. I held my phone in my hands for nearly an hour, thumb hovering over the record button, terrified of what I might hear the next morning. But curiosity won out over fear, as it always does, and I finally pressed start before placing the phone back on the nightstand. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the night, the distant traffic, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft whistle of wind through the barely open window. Every small noise made me tense, wondering if it was my voice beginning to speak words I wasn't conscious of saying. When I finally drifted off to sleep, my dreams were filled with hospitals and bright lights, with the sound of machines beeping and the antiseptic smell that my recorded voice had mentioned. In the dream, I was lying in a bed, tubes and wires connecting me to monitors that trace the rhythm of my life in glowing green lines. Someone was holding my hand, crying, saying my name over and over again. I woke before my alarm, my heart pounding and my sheets soaked with sweat. The first thing I did was check the app, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely navigate to the recording. It was there again. Another long recording, another conversation that I had no memory of having. This time, I didn't hesitate. I put in my earbuds and started listening immediately. "You're getting closer," the older voice said, and I noticed that it sounded more distant than before, as if it were speaking from farther away. "You're starting to remember the dreams," my younger voice replied, and I could hear the exhaustion in it. The bone, deep weariness that matched exactly how I felt upon waking. I keep having these dreams about hospitals and accidents and people crying. "They're not dreams," the older voice said gently. "They're memories. Things that happened before you came here." "Before I came where?" my younger voice asked, and the question hung in the air like incense, heavy and meaningful. "To this place between sleeping and waking," the older voice explained. "This space where time moves in circles and nothing is quite what it seems. You've been here longer than you think." I paused the recording, my heart hammering against my ribs. The conversation was becoming more specific, more detailed, and with each word, I felt a growing sense of recognition, as if I were remembering something I'd tried very hard to forget. I forced myself to continue listening. "How long?" my younger voice was asking. "Long enough that the people in the waking world have stopped waiting for you to come back," the older voice replied, and there was infinite sadness in those words. "Long enough that they've learned to live without you." "I don't understand," my younger voice said, but there was less conviction in the denial now, as if understanding was beginning to dawn, despite the protests. "The accident," the older voice said patiently. "The car spinning on the wet road. The tree that came up so fast you didn't have time to brake. The moment when everything went dark and quiet and still." I stopped the recording and sat in the growing daylight, pieces of memory floating back to me like debris washing up on a shore. A rainy night 3 years ago. Driving home late from a friend's birthday party. The radio playing softly, the windshield wipers keeping steady time. A curve in the road that I'd taken 100 times before. But this time the wheels lost their grip on the wet asphalt. The tree, the sound of metal crumpling and glass breaking, the sudden silence that followed, and then nothing. A gap in my memory that stretched from that night until I woke up in this apartment, in this life that felt real, but somehow insubstantial, like a photograph that was slowly fading at the edges. I picked up my phone and continued the recording, my hands no longer shaking, because I was beyond shock now, beyond fear. I was in that strange, calm place that comes when you finally understand something terrible and true. I'm dead, my younger voice was saying on the recording, and it wasn't a question anymore. Not dead, the older voice corrected gently. Suspended, caught between one moment and the next. The doctors call it a coma. But that's just their word for something they don't understand. How long have I been here? My younger voice asked. 3 years. 2 months and 16 days. The older voice replied without hesitation. Your body is in a long-term care facility outside the city. Your family visits every week. Your mother reads to you from books you loved as a child. I could hear crying on the recording soft. Heartbroken sobs that I realized were coming from both voices, older and younger. The sound of a soul mourning itself. Is there a way back? My younger voice finally asked. I don't know, the older voice admitted. I've been looking for one, but this place has its own rules, its own gravity. The longer you stay, the harder it becomes to remember why you wanted to leave. The recording ended there, cutting off abruptly, as if someone had pressed stop in the middle of the conversation. I sat in my bed, staring at the phone, trying to process what I'd heard. If the voices were telling the truth, and some deep part of me knew they were. Then, everything, I thought, I knew about my life was an illusion. This apartment, with its careful normalcy and unremarkable details. The job I went to every day, but could never quite remember the specifics of. The friends who existed mainly as names in my phone. Faces I could picture, but conversations I couldn't recall. The life that felt real moment by moment, but somehow lacked the weight and texture of true experience. I looked around the bedroom, really looked at it for the first time. The furniture was generic, like something from a catalog. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph, a picture of me smiling at the camera. But I couldn't remember when or where it had been taken. Even the morning light coming through the window seemed somehow artificial. Too perfect, like a stage set designed to look like reality. Over the following nights, I continued to listen to the conversations between my two selves. The younger voice, the one that still clung to the illusion of waking life, gradually accepted what the older voice had been trying to tell it. They talked about the accident, about the months of unconsciousness that followed, about the slow realization that consciousness itself had become a kind of prison. The app isn't real, the older voice explained during one conversation. It's just your mind's way of trying to make sense of something that has no rational explanation. The part of you that's still fighting, still trying to wake up, has found a way to communicate with the part that's accepted this existence. But if none of this is real, my younger voice asked, then how do I get back to what is? That's the question I've been trying to answer. The older voice replied, but I'm beginning to think that maybe the answer isn't about getting back. Maybe it's about choosing to let go. I stopped going to my job, whatever it was. I spent my days in the apartment, listening to the recordings, piecing together the fragments of truth from the conversations between my divided self. The outside world began to feel increasingly distant, like a television program playing in another room. The conversations grew shorter as the nights passed, and the older voice began to fade, becoming harder to hear. During the final recording, I was able to make out clearly. It spoke directly to me, not to my sleeping self, but to the part of me that would listen in the morning. You know the truth now, it said, and the voice was so faint I had to strain to hear it. The choice is yours. You can keep living in this shadow of life, in this place between sleeping and waking. Or you can choose to move on, to whatever comes next. But what about the people who are waiting for me? I heard my younger voice ask, and I realized it was speaking for me. Asking the question I was too afraid to voice. They love you enough to let you go. The older voice whispered, they've been letting you go, bit by bit, every day for 3 years. Your mother still reads to you, but she's started reading stories about journeys and farewells. She knows, even if she can't say it out loud. That night, I didn't activate the sleep app. Instead, I lay in the dark, thinking about the life I'd been living and the life I'd left behind. Thinking about a hospital room where my body lay connected to machines that breathed for me and fed me and kept my heart beating, while my consciousness wandered in this liminal space, this place of almost life. I thought about my mother, sitting beside a bed where I lay motionless, reading stories about letting go. I thought about the friends who had gradually stopped visiting, not from lack of love, but from an understanding that their vigil was becoming a prison for all of us. I thought about the moment of impact, the tree rushing toward me, and the strange peace that had followed the terror. In the morning, I didn't check my phone. I sat by the window, looking out at the world that was and wasn't real, and made my choice. The apartment began to fade around the edges, like a photograph left too long in the sun. The carefully arranged furniture, the generic artwork, the life I'd built from half, remembered dreams, all of it became translucent, insubstantial, revealed for what it had always been, a waiting room between one existence and the next. I closed my eyes and let myself fall backward into the darkness, finally ready to discover what lay beyond the place between sleeping and waking. The last thing I heard was a sound like machines powering down, like monitors going silent, like breath being released after being held for far too long. And in a hospital room 3 states away, a woman who had spent 3 years reading bedtime stories to her sleeping son finally closed the book and kissed his forehead goodbye, understanding at last that love sometimes means learning when to hold on and when to let go. The sleep app on the nightstand showed one final recordings. 7 hours of perfect, peaceful silence.